After a couple of days, it was clear to me and Nick that Allie was harder to get a hold of than anticipated. One day she'd be at the edge of town, the next she would be in the next state over. We figured she was getting some kind of help with transportation. Maybe somebody was driving her. It wasn't far enough for her to be on a plane, but she was definitely not traveling on foot anymore. Nick tried to convince Charlie to put up a roadblock, but it just couldn't be done. Not just because there was no point to it, on paper, but also because she would lose her job. It'd be apparent that she was still in contact with us. And while it wasn't illegal for her to talk to Nick or me, it was something she would get fired for. She figured she could do more good where she was, rather than at home with her kids. And Nick and I would keep our ears on the police radio, and I would stand in the living room like a walking dowsing rod, feeling with an outstretched hand which way Allie was going. It changed so often and so fast. This kept going well into November, and there would be calls from the station asking Nick to get back on the force, but he just hadn't answered. It was a dumb tactic, but it worked for now. Chances were it wouldn't work for long. They'd either get tired of asking and start telling, or they would figure out that he was up to no good. Nick didn't seem all that bothered though. For all bad things that one could say about Sheriff Mason, he and Nick were on good terms. And then came a day when Allie's movement stopped. It was sudden, and from what I could feel, not too far away. She was still moving around a little, but not nearly as far or as often. She wasn't dead. Something had changed, and I didn't like it. Nick and I had prepared to face her and be done with this whole ordeal. But what were we going up against? And before we could figure out an answer, we got a call. It was a foggy Tuesday afternoon when Charlie called me. I had been shooting cans in the backyard when I heard the phone. I slumped down in a raggedy plastic chair and picked up, cracking open a lukewarm beer. "Yeah," I said. "I'm hearing some chatter on John Digman. I think the Duck are gonna make a move." So, if you don't want the Duck involved in this whole Yearwalker business, maybe you ought to pay him a visit first. Give him a heads up." "I don't give a shit about John Digman," I said. "Not after that stunt that he pulled at the Hatchet facility." "Look, I'm just telling you what I know. You play whatever cards you want." There was a slight pause as Charlie took a deep breath. I could hear her walking away, possibly locking herself in the bathroom. Maybe somebody was listening. "Besides," she continued, "it sounds like you won't be around for long anyway." And with that, I got a dial tone. I relayed my talk to Nick. He was just as skeptical as me, but we were getting into enemy of my enemy territory, and John Digman was an insider among insiders. We were worried about what we were getting up against, and I could only think of two people who might have an idea. One of those people would be John Digman. And with that, Nick and I went to see him. It wasn't a long drive, just a little past the downtown area, to an apartment complex on the outskirts of town. Not the fanciest place, but we had driven by there a couple of times on patrol. "Didn't we do a wellness check here once?" I asked Nick as I leaned against his car. "Isn't that what we're doing now?" He snarked back. "I suppose," I said, "but this feels a lot more casual." "Yeah," Nick nodded. "Casual. We're all chill and shit." "Right." We walked past the reception and up the stairs. We had been given an address by Charlie. They had kept a close look on Digman for some time, but she had assured us that we would be in the clear for a couple of hours. They mostly checked him in the evenings, and this man didn't have a lot of evenings left. There was a small corridor leading to a shallow plywood door painted a bright pastel green. If a burglar wanted to get into this place, they could just punch their way through. This place was as secure as a tent. Still, they had to be doing something right. Maybe it was the landlord. They had quite a reputation around town. I knocked on Digman's door but didn't get a response. I looked over at Nick, who just shrugged at me. I knocked again. We waited a couple of minutes, whispering to one another in the meantime. "I can text Charlie," I said. "Maybe we got the wrong place." "Yeah, we should just go in," Nick said. "We can't just break the door and go." "Why not?" "We're not cops. What you're describing, Nick, is a home invasion." Sure." He barely needed to kick it in. A brisk shove with the shoulder was enough to break the whole thing wide open. The place was a mess. It looked like somebody had lived in that room for weeks, possibly months. Open takeout boxes paired with half-drunk soda and eroding paper cups. A smell of dying sugar and festering mold. I didn't even need to look around to know that there'd be cockroaches. Nick almost gagged. And before we got a chance to look around, we spotted him. He was in a chair by the window turned outward, away from the door. It was strange. From that angle, all he could see was the top of a tree. The rest was just sky. John Digman looked terrible. His skin was turning an actual gray and his hair looked metallic. His eyes were bloodshot and his breathing labored. The first thing that I thought of when I saw him was some kind of horror store mannequin. It didn't make sense that a man like that could still be alive. Nick couldn't keep a straight face. For all his disgust and mistrust of John Digman, I could tell that he hated seeing him like this. These two had met on more than one occasion. They probably knew each other pretty well, all things considered. Nick walked up to him, leaning against the window. "Jesus, John," he said. "You look like shit." John didn't move his head. He turned his eyes upward. Even that took a tremendous amount of effort. "Screw you," he coughed. Some things never change, I guess." I faced John, who turned his gaze to me. There was something there, a spark of recognition. We had talked before back at the Hatchet facility. There was a tinge of something at the corner of his mouth. Was he happy to see me, or was he trying to say something? His eyes turned downward towards his hand. He blinked at me. The words just wouldn't come. I reached out and touched his hand. Little strings of metal protruded from his fingernails. Little strands of white protruded from mine. In a moment of understanding, that twitch in his mouth curled into a smile. "Figures," he whispered. I looked up at Nick. "Give us a minute." And Nick was more than happy to step outside for a bit. As I held John's cold hand, his eyes rolled back into his skull. Seconds later, mine did too. It's hard to explain the sensation of stepping away from yourself. It's like when you've been sitting down for so long that your body doesn't feel like a body anymore. It's just a vessel for something else. You detach. That's what I felt like. I was moving away from something that I didn't need. Away from that sensation. The world looked a whole lot different, and yet familiar. The world looked a bit darker with a tint of midnight blue. We were in the same apartment, but the windows were busted. Far in the distance, we could see a towering tree, reaching for the moon. I wasn't really me and John wasn't really John, and yet we were just as us as we would ever be. I hate to say it, but in that space, John was sort of handsome. His long hair was stripped of all metal-tinted gray, and his eyes were this warm, green-brownish mix. He looked 20 years younger. He looked like a kind of roadie at an underground punk concert, the kind who would share his bottle of water with you. "Oh, it's so much better out here," John sighed. "So quiet." He got out of his car, or what remained of it. It looked slightly different and a whole lot more disintegrated. The thing nearly fell apart as he got up. I guess I'll be seeing more of this place soon enough. He continued. It's that bad, huh? I said. Yeah. He leaned against the wall with a heavy sigh, rubbing his tired eyes. He put his hands in his pocket and talked out loud. It's not an infection, really, he said. It's more like a merger. But it's not just a thing, it's you. A different you. And there are so many of those. That doesn't make any kind of sense. Well, there's this you, he said, pointing at me. The one from this place. And then there's another one somewhere else. One that's on fire. One that's evolved in underwater caves. Another that's just a stringy, hungry animal. I'm guessing that's the one that I got, I said. I don't feel very on-fiery. Yeah, no. You would know if it was the fire one, he said. It's all like branches from a really long tree, or different heads of a hydra, but it's all just you. I thought back on the people that I had seen in the hatchet facility, those who drank from the sprinklers. They weren't the same as me and Allie. Different branches, same tree, all just trying to come to light, to exist, to get away from whatever a hellhole had been. What about those who can't control themselves? I asked. Some just lose control, others just die. Nature doesn't care, and like it or not, this is nature, he said. Different natures trying to coexist in a system that never prepared to mix, but still nature. Sometimes it gets weird. Can we fix them? I asked. What, all of them? No, that's not realistic. And what about just one? He thought about it and then shrugged. I suppose, he said, but you gotta go pretty far out. I don't think you're ready for that. Maybe we could get a hold of the woman in the captain, I said. The one who fixed me. Holy shit, John laughed. You met Dawn. I'm surprised she's still around. You know her. Oh, every place has one of those, he said. Sometimes it's just a kid in a blue sweater. Sometimes it's a woman in a caftan. I think one of them was just some guy named Tom. Every place has someone who cares for it, and when it falls to shit, they usually do too. He leaned out the broken window, poking away some of the remaining glass shards. It was a nice night out. Then again, it was hard to tell the time of day. It seemed to always be night here. There was this one place where Clark Gable ran for president, he said. Crazy shit. I think they had him on the $10 bill. Man lived to be 85. I joined him looking out the window. I wonder what that would have been like, I said. A whole other world. Oh, there's a lot of them, John nodded. And I got this strange feeling. About what? He took a deep breath and slowly exhaled. He closed his eyes for a couple of seconds. When he opened them, there was a sparkle that I hadn't seen before. A bit of life. Maybe there will be another place in another time, where two unlucky people figure this out again, he said. And maybe one of them will joke that there was once this one world where we elected a reality show host as president. You think so? It's way crazier than Clark Gable. Fair. He stepped away from the window and there was a faint blue glow to his eyes. Something had changed. You ought to go back, he said. I'll see about that thing. Oh, what thing? Helping someone, he said. Just one, all right. I nodded and stepped away from the window. All right, I said. Let's go back. No, he said, shaking his head. Just you. I gasped as I pulled back. It was bright outside and the white strands in my fingers retracted. It felt like I had held my breath for a full minute. The air in me was stale and barren. And in front of me lay John Digman, dead. It was unceremonious and ugly. Nick had come back inside the moment that he heard me gasp. The two of us just stood there for a moment. And Digman had been a part of our world since the moment that I came to Tomskog. And with his death came this passing of the torch. I just couldn't fathom whom the torch had been passed to, or how. "He said that he would help," I muttered. "He said that." "All right." Nick didn't question it. I was so thankful for that. For a moment, I just leaned my head against his shoulder. I couldn't help but to sob a little. He didn't say a thing. Maybe John was right. Maybe there would be another place with other people, figuring out the very same things. And maybe in that time and place, we would be the strange ones, the monsters. But right now, we were just people. And maybe that was okay. There wasn't a lot that we could do. We had to leave him there, or the duck would get on our back within a day. We still had work to do. And Nick and I propped the door back up and left John behind. It was too late to do anything anyway. He had seemed like a practical man. He wouldn't have wanted us to risk anything for the sake of ceremony. Instead, we got back in the car and gave each other a tired look. "So what next?" Nick asked. "I say we go for it," I muttered. Just like that. He said that he would help. And Nick turned his attention to the road, nodding to himself. "All right," he said. "We'll go tonight." And we planned what we could. We had a heading and we had hunting rifles. There was no better way to time this, and there was no point in dragging it out. We were going to deal with Allie once and for all, and then we were heading to Dallas. We turned our phone off and left them at Nick's place. There was no way to tell what or who we'd encounter, and we didn't want anybody to track us. This was off the grid as much as it was off the record. Nick had got us masks, gloves, and a set of spare clothes to change into. In fact, he was ready to leave town at the drop of a hat. If everything went to plan, we were heading for Dallas in the morning. Packing everything into his car, we set off just before midnight. On the way there, Nick put on the radio, just background noise to drown out the most worrisome thoughts. We had gone from law enforcement to vigilante, and now we were closing in on being downright assassins. It turned my stomach. I wondered if my mother would have accepted me like this. "What are you gonna do in Dallas?" Nick asked. Maybe he just wanted to break the silence. I wouldn't have put it past him. Probably get a small place somewhere, and maybe work retail," I said. "Retail?" Nick frowned. "You okay to work with people like that?" "We work with people all the time, Nick." "Yeah, but we usually got handcuffs." Maybe I'll do something with handcuffs then." Nick snorted. The radio host prattled on about God knows what, laughing to themselves. Just like us. We turned onto a dirt road leading up onto a hill and into the pines. We weren't that far from the Hatchet facility distance-wise. There was a lot of uncomfortable terrain in between, but a bird could probably get there in 20 to 30 minutes flat. A thought crossed my mind. Maybe Allie was going back. Making our way upwards, we left the car far behind. There were no trails, so we had to make our way through the underbrush. The November wind was picking up. Nick muttered something about rain, and I could feel the sting of a chill. It was going to be a long night. As we had reached the top of a hill, the ground evened out. Moving between the pine trees, we found an opening. Looking out, we could tell that we were in the right place. It was a small valley hidden in the middle of nowhere. The ground was covered in blue sunflowers and small handmade wooden structures. Huts more like, just a handful. "Is this it?" Nick whispered. "Yeah," I said. "She's here." I could feel it. That little part of me calling out to me, telling me to join with the others. Allie was there and she felt different, clearer, calmer. We positioned ourselves on the top of the hill, using the scopes of our rifles as binoculars. We could see people moving about, a handful at most. Most wore these strange hand-carved masks. One guy had a plastic cutting board as a mask. Reaching out towards them, I felt something but different. They weren't like me or Allie, but there was something there, a seed. We watched them for about an hour or so. We could see them moving between buildings. We counted them, giving them names like Spiky and Limpy. We counted 6 of them moving about, with another 6 or 8 either resting or staying inside, but none of them looked like Allie. "Maybe we ought to just start popping them," said Nick. "Flush her out." "Unless she disappears again," I said. "I say we wait." "For what?" "For whatever." "Well, that's a shit plan," Nick said. "You're a shit planner." "We're still doing it," I added. "I'm not missing this chance." Nick shook his head and turned his attention back to the scope. He didn't like it, but he wasn't about to let me do this on my own. Stupid or not, it was better to be stupid together. We stayed there for 2 hours before we saw commotion. Someone was running through the field. I barely registered the movement at all. I heard it before I saw it. People were laughing and screaming, like it was a big game. Steadying my rifle against a rock, I got a closer look. Perry Digman, the yearwalker. They had captured him. They had kept him there. That's why Allie was drawn out and why she was around. "They're gonna kill him," I said. "We gotta pick them off." "They're not killing him," said Nick. "If they wanted to, they would have. She's down there somewhere, right?" "Right. So why hasn't she killed him then?" It was a good question. The thought crossed my mind that maybe whoever had killed the yearwalker might have to take their place. If that was the case, it'd be in their best interest to keep them around until the end of the year. Or maybe they were fattening him up like a pig. I had no idea. "They got their reasons," I sighed. "Probably." There was a snap of a twig, somewhere close. I repressed my instinct to move. Instead, I kept my head down and I listened. There were footsteps all around us, and they weren't trying to hide it. They were clumsy, stumbling through the forest like a newborn deer. I peeked over at Nick, holding up a finger to my lips. He nodded. A couple of people walked past. They were barely upright. Some of them didn't have shoes on. Others were barely dressed to be outside. As 1 became 8, I started to recognize a couple of them. I had seen them back at the facility. They weren't paying much attention, and within a few minutes, they had passed us by. I tried to keep myself from holding my breath, instead forcing air into my lungs at a steady pace. The last thing that you want is for a sudden exhale to give you away. But then the last stranger passed us by, and that was someone far more familiar to me. She was dressed in a gray hoodie and had this black pixie-like haircut. Elizabeth Salinger. How the hell had she made it here and why? I knew it was a dead giveaway, but I couldn't keep my eyes off of her. Her out of all people. Before I could figure out an answer, her head turned to me, those piercing eyes cutting straight through the night and meeting mine. I felt like a rabbit being stared down by a lion, like she was about to do something violent at any second. Instead, she blinked at me, A little water poured out of her mouth as she gargled. She made a noise, this awful guttural grunt, like she was trying to swallow her own throat. And then she coughed up a glob of water and spoke.
Just one.
She gargled. And with that, she turned her attention away, leaving me to finish whatever business I had. Turning to Nick, my eyes were wide open. He kept looking at me and then back at her and then back at me again. I shook my head at him. Just one. After that, hell broke loose. We saw Perry Digman get a hold of a rock and chase off his attackers as they closed in on him. They clearly weren't trying to kill him. They were either toying with him or trying to capture him. Either way, they were about to get some company. Elizabeth and her sore-infected crowd were heading straight for them. I had no idea what was about to go down, but we had a different target in mind. Perry was already heading off straight into the woods on the opposite side. "She's not coming out," I said, "and shit's about to hit the fan." "Oh, what are you suggesting then?" Nick whispered. "We go down there," I said. "Stay low and I'll get a better idea of where she is. And then we finish it." "You up for that?" he asked. Of course I was. As Perry and the masked folks ran off, Nick and I got up. I'd help the kid if I could, but there was just no time. And yet I had this feeling that John was still around to help in some way. We made our way down the hill and into the field of sunflowers. As we moved around, we noticed poles with electronics attached to them. Old phones, speakers, radios. Anything that could produce a noise or an image. Some of them even worked. While I didn't understand it, a part of me seemed to enjoy it. There was a pit in my stomach that liked the noise of the in-between spaces. The static. It was comforting, not to me, but a part of me. There were still masked people running about. Nick and I stayed low and out of sight, hoping against hope that they wouldn't get too close to notice. I had pulled my mask up. It was strange. The sunflowers almost moved out of the way as we passed through, like they were inviting us to get closer. I didn't like it. Dry and dead things should rustle when you move past. They shouldn't bend out of their way. We moved past what looked like a root cellar where they had kept Perry. A nasty place, some kind of underground prison cell. Not much further ahead, I could see a log cabin. It was sort of hidden away by the pine trees and barely visible in the night, but I felt that it was the place to go. That's where she was. There was screaming in the distance. Nick turned his attention to my right, and before I could react, he stood up. He raised his rifle and without a second thought, he fired. That one shot rung out like a dinner bell. There had been a masked man creeping up on us from the side, and now the jig was up. We had gone loud, and it was now or never. Nick slapped me on the shoulder without lowering the rifle. He was telling me to go. I headed straight for the cabin as Nick reloaded and fired another shot. I could feel the trickle of rain. If we had stayed quiet a little longer, it would have masked our movement perfectly, but now it was too late. The door to the cabin flung open and a young woman in a green dress wielding a meat cleaver ran out. I aimed a shot at her leg and I pulled the trigger, sending her reeling into the dirt. All the fight ran out of her. She flung the meat cleaver to the side and crawled away, whimpering for me not to kill her. I hadn't intended to. I just reloaded and entered the cabin. It was a cozy enough place. 2 large rooms, a couple of carpets and a fireplace. A bed, some chairs, a table. It was quiet, and somehow that made it worse. Rounding the corner with my rifle raised, I saw a woman in a white dress. She was sitting with her back towards me, but I couldn't tell if it was Allie or not. It didn't look like her. Then again, there was no telling what might have happened to her these past few weeks. Months. But Allie had been rabid. This woman was sitting at a makeshift desk, putting pen to paper. She had a goose feather pen and an inkwell, for crying out loud. "Name?" I asked. "Oh, I'm sure you remember." I raised my rifle to shoot as she turned to me. My body froze. Her face was a tangled mess. It wasn't even a face anymore. It looked like a biologic mass, twisting and turning, competing to stay on top like a bucket of eels. The smoothness of bone gave way to the fibers of muscle. Her head looked more like a struggling bag, trying to contain a broken memory of a body. I was so mesmerized that I couldn't understand what I was looking at. The voice wasn't really coming from her, it was coming from that pit in my stomach, and the many screens and radios in the fields around us. There was even a walkie-talkie on the radio, and it was coming from there too. "Sorry about last time," she said. "It's been hectic." "So it is you. You're Allie." "In a manner of speaking," she explained. "But I become so many other things, so many other people. But I am what I am, yes. Good enough for me." Rifle raised, I squinted. I looked past the scope and into the iron sights. She wasn't moving, not throwing herself in the ground. No pleading, no begging. Instead, that swirling mass just looked at me. For a split second, I doubted myself. Maybe I ought to aim for her heart, her stomach. No. Headshot. The moment that I squeezed the trigger and the heartbeat before the bullet had pierced her skull. A single sound echoed in the cabin. Yes! She was excited, eager, like she had been waiting for something like this to happen. Blood spurted out of the back of her head, and the whirling mess in her face unfurled on the floor like an exploding flower, leaving only an empty sack of skin behind. It suddenly dawned on me what it reminded me of. That ungodly tree in the other world. That thing that reached towards the sky. An unnatural skin construction. An amalgamation. Just to be sure, I put a couple more bullets in her. Her heart, her lungs, 2 more in the stomach. It was strange, though. Looking at where she had sat, there was nothing there. What had she been writing on? The door burst open. There was a knock on the wall as to alert me to their presence. Not just anybody would do that. I knew that it was Nick before he rounded the corner. "We gotta go," Nick said. "There's more. A lot more." "Got it," I said. "We're done." The word hung in the air as time slowed to a halt. The forest grew darker, the clouds parted, and an impossibly large full moon loomed overhead. The roof of the cabin was gone, long since rotten away. I had been taken there into that space, into the other place where John and I had spoken, where a distant flesh tree reached for the moon. I didn't have a rifle. I saw a vague shadow of Nick as he faded out, leaving me alone with another person. Allie. She looked like herself in here. Calm, collected, calculated, friendly even. Something was screaming at me to run, and I was having a hard time arguing against it. And something else told me that it was a bad idea. She'd be faster and deadlier. "I figured something like this might happen," Allie said. "That's why I let that thing take my place to begin with." I turned to her. She was just a few feet away, as if she never left that writing desk. She was still there, but this time it wasn't empty. She was making notes as she read a basic leather-bound book called The Diary of Emmett Rask. Once you start to make sense of these places, there's really no limit to where you can go or what you can do, she said. Prop up a little straw doll to take your place and you can work in peace. Well, then I'll kill you here, I said. Ever thought of that? She raised an eyebrow at me and smiled. I'm so thankful that I met you, she said. You've enriched my life immensely. She said something else. It wasn't really a word as much as it was an intention, but these images flashed before me. But not really images, more like memories. Things that I had lived and experienced in other places. It was me, but another me. In one place there was fire, strange markings in the sky. I was being forced to the ground by masked creatures and speared with iron rods. They weren't killing me. They were pinning me to the ground to be consumed later, like skewering a worm on a hook. She never even asked for it. They just wanted to please her. In another place, I was dressed in a traditional cotton dress and dragged into a lake to drown. They had lied to me, telling me that it was for the good of the village, but it wasn't. It was for the good of her. And all the while, she just stood at the bank of the lake, looking blameless. I was in water but breathing. Something in the dark grabbed me by the neck, like they had done when I was a pup. But they dragged me to the forbidden deep, like she had demanded. I was to be eaten. A will to live can only get you so far. Teeth was the real force of nature. And it wouldn't stop. 1,000 places, 1,000 selves. The numbness of space, the searing heat of fire, the rot of acid. Volcanoes, lightning storms, trampled, cut, burned, sliced, starved, and crushed. One by one, they all gave way to her demands. A parade of deaths happening at her command. The heiress of something that I could barely understand. And then it was just me, the end of the line, the final one. And I was just standing there in front of her, struggling to remember my body. She had gotten up from her desk and taken off her reading glasses. I can't think of another way to consume you, she said. What can I even do that hasn't already been done? I couldn't answer. I couldn't speak. So many of me had never had lungs or mouths. Some had barely been born. I was having trouble finding myself and what I could do. My mind was reeling. Her hand crept closer. She reached for me. A touch. That'd be all it took. I'll have to improvise, she said. It'll be fun. Oblivion at her fingertips, somehow, somewhen. And none of me had been able to do anything, anywhere. What was I supposed to say? But then my jaw ached. It moved. Little white strands pushed themselves out of my mouth. They touched her hand, burning it, wrapping itself around her arm. She pulled back, but it wouldn't let go. Finally, she pulled with all her might. I had tried pulling on those strands before, but it had clung to my innards like an animal. This time it did nothing. There was no resistance. It let itself get pulled out, and like a clogged drain, the infection was ripped out of me. A mass of swirling white tendrils collapsed on top of Allie, burning her like a frenzied jellyfish. I understood. I had won over that thing inside fair and square, and this was my prize. It was giving me time. Even if it destroyed her in the here and now, this was temporary at best. But without the sore infection in me, she couldn't pull me back into this place. She would have to find her way back to my world, to my place, and that was not going to be easy. Allie screamed as her flesh sizzled and burned. She struggled as her fingers turned to bone and her nerves failed her. She collapsed to the floor. I wanted to say something, but it would be useless. That thing in a way was me, another me. And just like countless others, it was going to die. It had already started to wither, the little white strands twitching as the primitive nerves began to die. It was already fading, but I was going to live. I turned to run, and the moment I did, I tripped. landing face first into a field of dry blue sunflowers. I was out. Real. It was so disorienting, but I could feel myself moving. I couldn't stop. Nick pulled me up to my feet. "Come on," he yelled. "Don't weird out on me now. We're going to Dallas, goddammit." Dallas, right. I coughed and something felt odd. I was lighter, empty. I even sounded differently. Had this thing been poking at my voice? We made our way back up the hill. The masked ones were freaking out, tearing their hair out and running screaming into the woods. One of them set the cabin on fire and then themselves. It wouldn't last for long in the rain, but it managed to collapse the roof. By the time that we got back to Nick's car and slammed the door shut, I was soaking wet and ice cold. Nick was no better off. He dumped the hunting rifles into the back of the car and started it up. As he put the gear in reverse, I couldn't help but let out a cry. Nick had his hand on the parking brake, but he stopped himself. There was this deep sadness in me that I couldn't explain. Just touching upon the memories of those different places and ends, it made my heart ache. It wasn't fair. Was it all my fault? I couldn't help but to cry. Nick put a hand on my shoulder, giving me some time to collect myself. "Let's just go," I said. "Let's go to Dallas." "Are we done?" he asked. "I don't know," I bawled. "I don't know, and I'll never know. This is too much, Nick. It's beyond what I can do, what anyone can do." "So we're not done," he sighed. "That's what you're telling me." I threw my hands up in surrender. How could you fight something like Allie, the blameless woman? Nick turned the ignition off, leaving us both in the dark. He took his hands off the wheel and looked straight ahead. We sat there for a couple of minutes as he stroked my shoulder with his thumb. "I don't think she can die," I said. "It's impossible. So why not just go? Why not just go to Dallas?" "Oh, because we said one more thing," Nick said. "We said this one last thing and then Dallas. That was the deal. I'm not one to break a deal." "But it'll never be just one last thing," I cried. "She won't stop, not here, not anywhere, not when, not how. I don't know, Nick." "Well, then we'll figure it out," he spat back. "We figure it out and then we deal with it." He put the car in reverse, turned around, and started driving us back down the dirt road. As he did, he tried to say something, but the radio distracted him. He turned it off with a groan. "I don't want to date you," he said. "I don't want to bang you, and I don't want to have some kind of asexual, not relationship, but kind of thing going. We're not like that." I didn't say anything. I let him go off. He clearly had something on his mind. "I don't have a lot of friends," he said. "Hell, my brother and I are like, what, second cousins? I mean, we're not, but we're like that, you know." He laughed as he took a turn a little too harshly. "I don't even know his birthday," Nick laughed, "and he doesn't know mine. All these people, they're people. Off in the distance, somewhere over there, you know. But you're here. You're with me. You don't give a shit about the little things and you look past the shit. You know how rarely I get that. How rarely I get someone in my life who gives a shit." He held up a finger. "I got that once. One time. And we all know what she did." He continued. "But you're not like that. You're not running off unless we agree on it. We're partners, real partners, and that's gotta mean something." "Nick, you don't have to." "No, forget that," he said. "This isn't just your deal anymore, it's our deal. And I don't care if it's not possible, we're gonna do it anyway." He slammed his foot on the brake, sliding to the side of the road. He turned to me with a deep sigh. "We do this thing and then we're heading to Dallas," he said. "Or are you running off?" I leaned back in my seat, feeling the unease swirl in me. The pictures of the many ends that I could, would, and had faced. But Nick wasn't looking at that. He was looking at his start. And I didn't have a whole lot of those to treasure. I turned to him, wiping away a tear. Nick opened the driver's side window, letting in some fresh air. "No, Nick," I said. "I'm not running." He nodded at me and took off his pink sunglasses. With a flick of the wrist, he tossed them out the window. I bet they're still there today, waiting by the side of a dirt road in rural Minnesota. And with that, we sped into the night. It was better to be stupid together. My hometown is in the heart of a national forest, and people go missing out there all the time. Backpackers who overestimate their capabilities or supplies. Teenage campers who fail to respect the dangers of the woods. Day-tripping families who put too much trust in their devices. If it had been any of them who had disappeared, I never would have joined the search and rescue effort. It's not that I didn't care. I was visiting for the first time in almost 10 years and only had 3 days to reconnect with all my old friends. At the time, I wasn't really sure what had kept me away for so long. I used the standard excuses about being busy with work and family obligations, but they weren't entirely true. Sometimes I still had dreams about being in the backseat of my parents' SUV on the morning that we moved, looking out at the rainy hills and feeling somehow certain that I shouldn't come back. It was an odd feeling meeting up with people that I hadn't seen in a decade. I had lived in town until the age of 17 and knew how hard life out here could be. But I was still unprepared to see the ravages of age, obesity, and drug abuse on people whose healthy, happy smiles I still remembered fondly. By the end of the first day, I realized that it was more than the disjunct between my memories and reality that was making me uneasy. People seemed tense around me, on edge, as though they wanted to judge how much I already knew before speaking about certain topics. I wondered miserably whether I was considered an outsider now, or whether perhaps there was something more going on beneath the surface. If Chet Miller had been able to hold his liquor, I might never have discovered the truth. Chet was an old buddy from high school, and I was staying with him during my visit. Each night, the two of us went to shoot pool at Sloan's, a dive bar just off the 2-lane road through town. While I watched him struggle drunkenly with the cue ball, I finally gave voice to what had really been bothering me. Why hadn't my best friend, Daniel Barnes, contacted me at all? Daniel didn't use social media, but it was a small town and I was sure that he knew about my visit all the same. Danny could have at least given me a call, I grumbled, and I downed the rest of my drink. It took me a while to realize that Chet had stopped even pretending to play pool. He leaned on the table and stared at me blearily. "You mean nobody's told you?" I shook my head. I had no idea what he was talking about. "Danny went for a walk last Friday and he hasn't been back since," Chet explained. "He told his ma that he might be gone for a while and that she shouldn't worry. But it's been 4 days now and the old lady's starting to panic. There'll be a search called by tomorrow. You'll see." Everything suddenly made sense. Maybe people had been so guarded because they weren't sure if I had heard about Danny. Maybe they didn't want to ruin my brief stay in town with worries that might turn out to mean nothing. Daniel Barnes had always been an odd character, even for a backwoods place like this one, and it wouldn't be the first time that he had gone into the woods alone. The strangest part of the whole thing was the secrecy. If Danny had just wanted to get away from the world for a little while, why bother telling anyone at all? Why warn his mother not to worry? Maybe I thought uncomfortably. It all really was just a big misunderstanding. Maybe I would wake up to a text from Danny asking when we were going to grab a cold one at Sloan's. At 6 a.m. the following morning, Daniel Barnes was officially declared missing. Sheriff Hopewell announced that teams were being formed to search the forest near the area where his pickup had been found. It was odd to think of Max Hopewell, one of the worst troublemakers in our high school, as law enforcement, but there was no time for that now. I was dialing the number for the volunteer hotline before I even realized that my fingers were moving. This was Danny Barnes, after all. Danny, who I had spent countless hours with during my childhood, playing late-night video games or shooting hoops in each other's driveways. This was Danny who had taken me under his wing years later and helped me overcome my painful teenage awkwardness. I had no doubt that he would have done the same for me. Daniel was an only child, and his single mom had always struggled to make ends meet. But if his background had bothered him, he never let it show. He was a star on our high school's basketball team, even if he couldn't splurge on designer shoes or equipment the way that some other boys could, and he had a love for reading that led him to become the top student in Miss Purcell's English class. At the same time, he was the one that we went to if a check engine light came on in one of our old beater cars, or if our parents wanted some firewood split. Daniel wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty to get what he wanted, but it seemed like all he wanted back then was to read his battered library books, hike every trail that he could find, and get laid as often as possible. With his long brown hair and athlete's physique, Danny had no problem finding a partner. On warm weekends, he would sneak out with his teammates and current girlfriend to camp at hidden spots in the forest. I had no idea how he found those places, but some of my happiest memories involved relaxing around a clifftop bonfire or skinny dipping in a midnight creek with my closest friends. It felt like those days would never end, until they did. Looking back, I suppose our parents knew what we were up to, but they let the whole thing slide. We were just teenagers being teenagers after all, and somehow nobody ever got badly hurt. And drugs and alcohol were involved, but Danny always stayed sober enough to drive us out if things went sideways. His maturity amazed me back then, and I often wondered why he never moved on to something better than this sleepy little town. And now I feared that he never would. The volunteer meeting point was at the same gravel pull-off where Danny's pickup was parked. Sitting there, covered by dead leaves and dust, it looked like some sort of ominous monument. My chest tightened when I recognized the trailhead beyond. This used to be one of our favorite hiking spots. Sheriff Hopewell stood beneath a tarp beside the trail sign, passing out highlighter yellow vests, bottles of water, and plastic whistles. It was a small town, and Danny had been well liked. Over 20 people had already shown up to join in the search. I saw Chet wearing sunglasses and grimacing as he sipped coffee from a paper cup. He waved at me, but Sheriff Hopewell had separated us into groups before we had a chance to talk. Since cell reception was almost non-existent in the mountains, each group of 4 volunteers would travel with a walkie-talkie into Sheriff's deputy. In principle, all of the deputies and attendants had search and rescue training, but most of them were out-of-towners who didn't know these hills as well as those who had grown up here. "Aaron?" Somebody gasped behind me. "What are you doing here?" And that voice chilled my blood, and even after all these years, I still recognized it. "Hi, Kaylee." I smiled weakly. Most people I figured had the one that got away. For me, that person was Kaylee Bowden. Unlike a lot of my old acquaintances, she had kept herself fit and her eyes still had the same spark that I remembered from high school. And back then, she had hated my guts. Daniel's too, if I remembered right. I wondered what she was doing here. Before I could ask, the young officer in front of us spoke up. My name is Deputy Lyle Higgins," he announced. "I want you all to form a line on each side of me. If you lose sight of the person to your right or left, stop and blow your whistle. We'll call out for Daniel as regularly as possible, but it's a big forest out there. Don't wear yourselves out." It wasn't until then that I realized I was in Kaylee's search group, and her position was right next to mine. We barely looked at each other as we stomped into the undergrowth, and we began shouting Danny's name. The sky was overcast, the forest floor still damp with dew. The snap of a stick beneath somebody's boot or the lonely caw of a crow only emphasized how quiet it was out here. Without a bunch of loud teenagers around or Daniel's confident presence by my side, these hills felt like a different place. Even so, I recognized a lot of the landmarks that we passed. And there was the big oak tree that Chet had broken his arm falling from during our sophomore year. There was the tall, phallic boulder which we had given a predictable nickname back then. I made sure to glance left and right from time to time to make sure that I was still in position. Kaylee to my left and... wait, who was on my right? I was at the end of the line. There shouldn't have been anybody there, and yet... When I looked again, the stranger was gone. Had they been a member of one of the other search and rescue groups? If so, where was their yellow vest? And why weren't they calling Danny's name? Had they been a hiker? In that case, why were they so far off the trail without any backpack? I had only gotten a momentary glimpse at them, but they seemed to be female, late teens or early 20s, wearing ragged clothes that had gone out of fashion years ago. I did a slow 360 turn, taking in the green ferns and mossy trunks around me, but there was no one to be seen. I realized with horror that by stopping, I had gotten separated from my group. A shrill whistle pierced the air. Kaylee and Deputy Higgins came jogging up to me. Both looked furious. Higgins warned me that if I fell behind again, I would be guided up to the trail and sent back. Kaylee said nothing, but the look on her face told me that this was just about what she had expected from someone like me. I tried to focus on the search, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the stranger that I had seen, or thought I had seen, in the woods beside me. The whole thing reminded me unsettlingly of the stories that we used to tell about the painted man. Depending which version of the local legend one believed, painted men might refer to an ancient tribe that had once dwelt in these hills. Some radical hippies who had created a commune out here during the 70s, or nothing more than the eerie artwork that could be found throughout this part of the national forest. The figures appeared beneath rock shelters, in caves, and even on giant trees. They were just doodles of little dancing people, although their eyes or teeth sometimes seemed a little too large, and their fingers sometimes looked more like claws. The archaeologists who had tested the paintings found that some dated back thousands of years, while others were less than a few months old. As a child, I had been frightened of them, but in all the years that Danny and I had spent stomping around these hills, I had never once experienced anything to make me believe that the painted men were anything but silly drawings. Now I wasn't so sure. And during our first break, Kaylee crouched down beside me and asked if anything was bothering me. "No," I lied. "Well, something is bothering me," Kaylee murmured, and then nodded toward Deputy Higgins. Although Kaylee hadn't criticized anything specific, I knew exactly what she was talking about. The search techniques that Higgins wanted to use didn't fit the terrain, and he had already gotten turned around a couple of times due to the maze of narrow trails. Those of us who had grown up here, like Kaylee and me, could use our memories and landmarks to find our way. For outsiders, it wasn't so easy. Higgins' jawline was tense as he reported in on his walkie-talkie. From the radio chatter, it was clear that none of the other search teams had found any sign of Daniel. "All right, let's get back in formation," and Deputy Higgins announced a few minutes later as he brushed away the crumbs of his lunch. If you see anything, and I do mean anything, blow your whistle. It might mean life or death for Daniel. Higgins might not have known these woods well, but he was clearly familiar enough with these sorts of operations to understand that time was running out. If missing people weren't found quickly, they often weren't found at all. As we got to our feet, I asked Kaylee the question that had been on my mind since I had first seen her. You know, I'm kind of surprised to see you out here. You and Danny weren't exactly close. I'm not out here for him, Kaylee snapped. Her dark blue eyes glared angrily into mine, and then she seemed to come to some sort of decision. She pulled her phone from her pocket and showed me screen captures of a text conversation between her and somebody else that I knew. Bethany. I was ashamed to admit it, but Beth had been the girl that I had dated because I couldn't get with Kaylee. She had been Kaylee's best friend back then, but I soon discovered that the two of them were as different in personality as they were in looks. The relationship hadn't even lasted a week, but we had gone on one of Danny's weekend camping trips together. Now, based on the conversation saved to Kaylee's phone, she had apparently taken another trip into the woods with the man himself, Daniel. In her messages, Bethany seemed excited about the trip and even talked about how charming and mature that Danny was. And then nothing. This chat is from 10 days ago, Kaylee said. I haven't heard from Beth since. Didn't you go to the police? I whispered. Well, of course I did, Kaylee scowled. I was told that unless there were signs of foul play, there was nothing that they could do. And then they suggested that maybe Beth, my best friend Beth, had stopped talking to me for a good reason. Like me being too nosy, for example. Eventually, I gave in and called Danny, but he said that his little camping trip with Beth had never happened, which means that either Beth is lying or Danny is. I know it's a long shot, but has she said anything to you? Has she contacted you at all? I shook my head. I hadn't spoken to Beth in years. Kaylee's story didn't make sense, but then again, neither did anything about Danny's disappearance. We continued trudging along the cliffside. We had been walking for about 10 minutes when Kaylee suddenly stopped dead. Her hand didn't go to her whistle. In fact, she didn't move at all. Aaron, she mumbled, could you come here for a second? My first thought was a rattlesnake. They were common in these hills, and I still remembered the morning that I had slept beneath the stars and woken up to feel a loathsome, cool weight draped across my foot. When I approached, however, I found that Kaylee was balanced precariously on a rotten log. Beneath her was a half-hidden pit that opened like a black mouth on the face of the mountain, and from where I stood, I couldn't see the bottom. The rotten wood creaked and splintered. I sprang forward, grabbed the straps of Kaylee's backpack, and pulled us both over backwards. We crashed onto the leaf-slickened ground and slid downwards toward the pit. I rolled over onto my stomach and managed to wrap my fingers around a gnarled tree root. Our fall ground to a halt. For the moment, at least, we were saved. For a while, we just lay there, arms wrapped around each other, breathing hard and glad to be alive. Moving was painful, and we slid down one step for every two that we progressed. But eventually, we were able to get away from the chasm. As we looked around for the others, 3 angry whistle blasts split the air. I've had it with you two, Deputy Higgins shouted, jogging over to us and narrowly missing the pit-like cave himself. This is the second time you've broken formation, and don't think I missed your little conversation during break. If you don't like my leadership, you're welcome to leave. HQ. Higgins spoke into the walkie-talkie. This is Higgins, I'm sending 2 back. And no, he added maliciously, they aren't welcome to join us again tomorrow. As Kaylee and I turned back toward the main trail, I took one last look at the cave-like pit that we had almost fallen into. There were more painted men scrawled on the rock, and from where we were standing, it looked like the tiny figures were dancing downward into the darkness. All that line formation crap was a stupid idea anyway, Kaylee announced as soon as the group was out of earshot. We should have split into pairs and checked the game trails that Danny liked to use. You know, like the one that goes down to the jumping rock by the river. I think we ought to start there. How about you? I stared. What? Kaylee laughed. You aren't seriously thinking of giving up, are you? Our friends are out there, and these idiots are searching in the wrong places. Fine, go back if you want, but I'm going to keep looking for Beth. I had no doubt that we'd be in deep trouble for disobeying Deputy Higgins' orders, but I wasn't about to let Kaylee go trapezing around the woods alone. Moreover, the further that we walked, the more that her idea made sense to me. Maybe Danny had taken advantage of the good weather to hike down to one of his secret spots and had gotten himself hurt. If he had, I was confident that he knew enough about survival to have made himself a shelter, created a signal, and stayed put. When Kaylee and I reached the jumping rock, however, all we found were old memories. A few fallen leaves floated on the surface of that deep, slow-flowing water, so dark and still that it looked like black glass. The bend in the river created a sort of rocky beach, and if I squinted my eyes, I could almost still see us diving off the big limestone boulder that towered above it all, shouting and doing flips without a care in the world. Only one thing was different. A sinuous trail wound into the hills behind the jumping rock, one that neither of us had ever seen before. Kaylee and I exchanged a glance, stripped down, and then swam across the stream. The sky overhead was gray, the water colder than I remembered. Had we really splashed and played here, in a stream that was so murky and deep that none of us had ever seen the bottom? At the time, I had barely given it any thought, but now I found myself wondering where all that water came from, and where it went. And we dried off with my baggy sweatshirt before putting on our clothes and boots, which we had held above our heads during the crossing. "This city life must have been good to you," Kaylee commented. "You've changed." "What do you mean?" I asked. "Oh, come on. Danny had a new girl every weekend back then, and you weren't much better. You broke Beth's heart, you know that. There was a house party that night you broke up with her and she got blackout. I spent the whole night holding her hair back in the bathroom and wondering if I should call an ambulance." "Wow, I'm sorry, I didn't know." As pathetic as my response sounded, it was the truth. I had figured that the flings that me and Danny had back then were just harmless fun. It made me wonder what else I had misinterpreted, what other warning signs I had overlooked. "If it wasn't for how you two had treated Beth," Kaylee went on, "I think we actually might have been friends. You were pretty cool for somebody who hung out with Danny anyway." I was glad to be walking behind Kaylee so that she couldn't see me blush. As we had noticed from the other side of the stream, this trail felt literally new. I could see where branches had been broken off and deadfall kicked aside. It looked like a whole tribe of people had been through here recently, but as far as I knew, Danny and a few close friends were the only ones who knew about the rock's existence. We had been walking for about 20 minutes when Kaylee paused and gestured at another series of painted men on the cliff wall beside us. She wrinkled her nose. "I wish somebody would lock up these damn graffiti artists and throw away the key. What sort of person wakes up in the morning and decides to scribble on a rock in the middle of the woods?" The hair on the back of my neck stood up. My gaze drifted to the top of the cliff, where 4 silent figures stood watching us. They stepped back into the shadows as soon as I had spotted them. but I was almost positive that one of them was the girl that I had seen before. Even after they had gone, my feet felt glued to the ground. I felt cornered and trapped, like a hunted animal waiting to be shot. The simple touch of Kaylee's hand was enough to make me jump. "Those weren't searchers, were they?" she murmured. I shook my head as the full weight of our predicament began to sink in. The jumping rock was at one of the lowest points in the forest. Most trails followed the ridgelines above. Worst yet, all of the search crews would have assumed we had gone back to HQ, meaning that whatever was out here, we were alone with it. I didn't want to keep following the strange new path, but turning back felt even more dangerous. At least we were headed upwards. If we were lucky, it might even join up with one of the official trails on the clifftop. Kaylee and I had never explicitly agreed on the need to move silently, but we both walked as quietly as possible as we ascended the steep slope. Maybe that was why we were able to surprise the stranger who came crashing through the undergrowth. Unlike us, he ran desperately, careless of where he placed his feet or how much noise he made. And Danny grunted with surprise when he saw us. He looked older, of course he did. A decade had passed after all. But there was more to it than that. The flecks of white in his beard and the dark circles under his eyes gave him a haunted look, as though something had shocked the vitality right out of him. He wore nothing but a ragged pair of white boxers, and didn't appear to have eaten anything in days. I noticed uneasily that beneath the scratches and the mud splatter, his bare skin was spiderwebbed with yellowish purple bruises. What are you two doing here?" Danny mumbled. He glanced nervously over his shoulder. He was acting almost like something was chasing him. Looking for you, of course." I smiled and reached out to give Danny's arm a squeeze. Relief coursed through my veins. We had found him. Everything was going to be all right. Danny swatted my hand away. "You shouldn't be here," he said firmly. "Both of you need to get out of the woods. Now." "Where's Beth?" Kaylee butted in between me and Daniel. Looking at his injuries, I could already imagine what she suspected. They might have been defensive wounds caused by her missing friend. And Danny's reaction wasn't what I expected. He collapsed on the trail and sobbed. It wasn't a cry of pain or sadness. It was born of utter, complete exhaustion. "It's fine. Let me be taken. I deserve it." Danny talked to his hands as though afraid to look either of us in the eye. "It was never supposed to get this far." "What was never supposed to go this far?" Kaylee demanded. All of her attention was focused on Danny, but I was squinting into the pathless undergrowth behind him. Where had he come from anyway? And what on earth could have frightened him so badly? "I was 13 the first time that I met one of them. Just a depressed, white trash kid looking for some peace and quiet in the woods. They told me that if I came with them, they would make everything better." Kaylee was getting angrier with each passing second, but if this was a confession, I needed to keep Danny talking, even though I might not like what he had to say. "Danny," I began gently, "you keep talking about they and them. Who are you talking about? Who did you meet out here?" "The painted men." It was the last straw for Kaylee. She grabbed Danny by his neck and slammed him to the ground. "My best friend is missing. You are the last person she was seen with. And you think this is time to make jokes?" As frail as Danny was, I was concerned that Kaylee's anger might do permanent damage. I moved in to separate them, but the look in Danny's eye made me hesitate. It wasn't hurt, angry, or afraid, just distant, as though there was nothing that anyone could do to him anymore. "You both grew up here. You remember the stories that we all grew up hearing. When I finally saw one of the painted men in the flesh, It was like, I don't know, magic. I figured that if that part of the legend was true, the rest might be true as well. I thought that maybe they could fix my life. I thought that maybe they could fix me. But it wasn't like that. It wasn't like that at all. They made me switch off my flashlight so that I couldn't get a good look at them. I saw their silhouettes though, stretched in black, like scarecrows against the twilight sky. When they told me to come underground with them, I was stupid enough to think that I could still refuse. I'll never forget the feeling of those 6 long fingers closing around my arm and pushing me into the mouth of the cave. It was the last time I saw daylight, until a few days ago. "Danny," I asked urgently, "do we need to get moving? Are we safe here?" My best friend rambled on, ignoring my question. "It was damp down there and dark, pitch dark. That's how they like it. They chained me to the stone and took my clothes. And then they started asking me questions. The name of my friends and people in my family, what my hobbies were, my favorite thing to eat. One of them grabbed my face in their hands and squeezed. There was a cracking noise and then another more awful sound, like meat being pressed through a grinder. And when the painted man spoke again, he was speaking with my voice. I figured they'd kill me then. It was only later that I learned they need to preserve the people whose lives they steal in order to refresh their appearance from time to time. I was held captive in absolute darkness. I drank what they drank, and God help me, I ate what they ate. The only signs of life from the surface were the others who they brought down, the ones who they used my appearance to catch. In high school, I hadn't thought that there was anything unusual about Danny's sudden popularity. Kids change all the time at that age, and he had just happened to grow into someone who was talented, handsome, and smart. It was all too easy to imagine what had happened next. A late-night camping trip, bonfire smoke and starlight. The thing that called itself Danny asks a girl to sneak off into the woods with him, and of course, she agrees. She probably doesn't notice the twisted shapes approaching among the trees, but if she does, their oversized eyes and wide mouths might remind her of the scrawlings on nearby stones. I had believed that Danny's friends and partners always came home safe from all those camping trips, but maybe some of them had never come home at all. Maybe some of them had been replaced by something else. How many of my old classmates were still chained to a cave wall underground? How many of the people I thought I knew were actually imposters? Just a few minutes ago, the idea would have sounded insane, but now I found myself almost believing it. More than anything else, the painted men want to be like us, you see. When they kidnap a hiker for food or just to torture them for fun, they always keep their possessions afterwards. They even wear their clothes. I thought of a raggedly dressed figure that I had seen earlier, and I shuddered. "They've been living here for centuries," Danny went on. "Maybe longer, and who knows how many they've taken." Danny's voice shook. "But a few days ago, something went wrong. That woman, Beth, I don't know how she did it, but somehow she was able to escape. She freed me as well and a few others. We felt our way along the pitch blackness, knowing that if we didn't make it to the surface before they returned, we were done for. It was sunset when we finally crawled out of one of the cave mouths. We decided to split up. I don't know what happened to the others after that, but a few hours after dark, I began to hear their screams." The sun had set beyond the ridgeline, turning the forest a gloomier shade of gray. Danny buried his face in his filthy, bleeding hands. "Go on, leave me. I haven't got the strength to make it out of here." In the quiet woods, the drawn-out whistle blast was deafening. Kaylee and I looked up. Whatever was going on sounded a lot more serious than just a line getting out of formation. "Come on," Kaylee insisted. "These woods are crawling with searchers. They'll be able to get all of us out of here before." Her words trailed off, but I knew she had meant to say before dark. Danny nodded weakly. He hobbled along between us while Kaylee walked in front, her ears pricked for the sound of the whistle. I, meanwhile, kept looking back over my shoulder. I wish the woods weren't so still. I wish that I could hear a bird's song, some foraging squirrels, anything. It felt like the whole forest was holding its breath. The rhododendron-covered hillside was steep, and more than once, Danny needed help just to keep moving. And then at the top of a narrow gully, we saw him, Deputy Higgins. His right pant leg was torn, and beneath it, his knee was bleeding. He had his back to us, and he was blowing into his whistle for all that he was worth. "You?" Deputy Higgins snapped when he saw Kaylee. "I thought I told you to. Well, never mind. I took a nasty slip and I got separated from the others. But look who I found." The ground seemed to drop out from beneath my feet when I saw the figures behind him. Danny and Beth. The pair of them grinned down at us as Deputy Higgins continued to brag. "Oh, the rest of the team should be here any minute. Then we can all head back to..." Higgins' voice trailed off. He had finally seen our Danny. The thing that looked like Daniel Barnes and never stopped smiling as it bent down, picked up a rock and smashed it into the side of Deputy Higgins' skull. He dropped, lifeless, to the ground. "Run!" Danny hissed desperately behind us. "You have to run!" He was so scared that he was shaking, but I was making a different calculation. Could I reach and unholster Deputy Higgins' service weapon before the two imposters could stop me? It was now or never. I lunged. As I snapped the pistol free and fumbled with its safety, the sun finally disappeared completely below the distant hills. There was a strangled cry behind me. I turned around in time to see two stretched, six-fingered hands reach out from a crack in the rock wall behind Danny. Before I could react, before I could even scream, Danny was pulled into the gap. For a moment, his bruised, half-naked form was caught in the narrow chasm. He stared up at me pleadingly, his eyes wide with terror. And then came a sickening snap, and the real Danny Barnes disappeared from the surface world forever. "They're down here, quick!" someone yelled. Raised voices and more shrill whistles closed in around us. A group of searchers scrambled down the cliff, their flashlight beams cutting bright swaths through the rapidly darkening woods. One of them was Chet, and his eyes widened when he saw the bleeding deputy who lay among the withered leaves. "Oh my God," he gasped. "It all happened so fast." The thing that looked like Beth pretended to cry. One minute he was on top of the cliff shouting that he had found us, and the next he was falling. "Yeah, he hit his head on a rock," the thing that looked like Daniel added, with a wicked smile in my direction. There was nothing that we could do. Fortunately, these two came along and called for help. Isn't that right? Some of the searchers were already staring nervously at the pistol in my hand. Kaylee caught my eye and shook her head. We had no proof that the pair in front of us were anyone other than Danny and Beth, and we had no way of knowing how many of the searchers were painted men wearing somebody else's skin. "If the whistle didn't work, I was going to fire off a few shots," I muttered. I handed Deputy Higgins' sidearm to Chet. If there was one thing that I was sure of, it was that he was too stupid to be anything but human. One of the other volunteers used Higgins' walkie-talkie to inform Sheriff Hopewell that Daniel Barnes and Bethany Dodd had finally been found. There was no way that they could have imagined the truth. During our whole trek out of the woods, I felt Daniel and Bethany's watchful eyes on the back of my neck. It churned my stomach to hear the story they told, a perfectly believable tale of going off trail in search of a camping spot and becoming lost for days in the woods. Their timeline didn't add up with the call that Kaylee had made to Danny about Beth's disappearance, but we had no more proof of that than we did of any of the rest of it. At any moment, I expected more of the painted men to emerge from the tree line, but the only thing we encountered before we had reached the road was a single deer. It ran from our little group in wide-eyed terror. Back at the HQ tent, our reception was exactly what I had expected. Paramedics wrapped blankets around the rescued pair's shoulders and took their vitals. Danny's mother threw her arms around an imposter, unaware that her real son was miles away underground. As local news reporters swarmed around us, the thing that looked like Daniel beckoned to Sheriff Hopewell to his side. He glared at Kaylee and me while he whispered something into the big officer's ear. Moments later, Sheriff Hopewell called us into his HQ tent alone. "I'd like to thank the two of you personally, and Danny tells me that if it wasn't for you, he and Bethany might never have been found." All I could do was nod. My throat felt too dry to speak. What was going on? Oh, it's easy to get confused out there in those woods. It's easy to take a wrong turn, or think you saw something you didn't. It's a dangerous place too. Who knows how many bones are rotting out there in the bottom of some cave. Sheriff Hopewell's hands drifted to the belt around his waist. One came to rest on the holster of his gun. I thought about the Max Hopewell that I knew back in high school. All the pranks he used to pull, all the rules that he had flouted. I never would have expected that one day he would wear a badge, and now that I thought about it, hadn't he been one of the most frequent attendees of Danny's camping trips? How sure was I that I was standing in front of the same person? Sheriff Hopewell drummed his fingers on his pistol grip. There was something hungry and hateful in his eyes that made me take a small step back. "Well, I suppose I'm just rambling." Sheriff Hopewell shook his head and laughed. "Hope you enjoy the rest of your stay and don't get into any trouble. After all you've been through together, I'm sure Danny and Beth will be eager to catch up with you." And Kaylee and I backed out of the tent slowly and then walked towards our cars. There was something eerie and lonesome about the crunch of our footsteps on the gravel. Don't take this the wrong way, but I don't think either of us should be alone tonight, Kaylee told me as we approached her sedan. I glanced at the crowd behind us. Several of the volunteers remained oddly still in spite of the chaos around them. All of them were glaring directly at us. I turned back to Kaylee and I made my decision. Kaylee lived in one of the only 2 apartment buildings in town, an ugly 6-unit brick structure just off the state highway. The first thing that we did upon arrival was to make sure that all the doors and windows were locked. After that, we heated up some soup and a pizza from the freezer, took a couple of beers out of the fridge, and sat down around Kaylee's rickety kitchen table to discuss our next move. "Your plan was to leave tomorrow," Kaylee reminded me, "and I think that you should stick to that." I started to protest, but she shushed me. "Listen, we've got no proof of what we know, and if we do anything out of the ordinary, all we'll do is draw attention to ourselves. We don't know what these things are or what they're capable of, and unlike you, I have to live here. Please, for my sake, just let it go." Kaylee bowed her head exhausted. "I think I'm gonna go take a shower. And do you want to take one first? Whoever stays out here can keep an eye on things. You see, at this time of night, most of my neighbors are at home asleep, so if you hear any movement in the hallway or see somebody standing outside the windows." I shivered, but I accepted her offer. It felt amazing to scrub off the residue of those woods, even if I couldn't wash away any of the disturbing truths that I had learned. I switched with Kaylee and sat down on the couch facing the windows. As tired as I was too nervous to sit still. I looked around Kaylee's tiny apartment, curious about who she had become during the past 10 years. And there were plenty of framed photos of her volunteering at a 5K race the county organized to promote good health, or handing out water bottles in the wake of the disastrous mudslide a few years back. Kaylee hadn't been much of a reader, but now her shelves were filled with books. One of them had been taken out and left on the coffee table, an album from our time in school. I readjusted myself on the sagging couch and leafed through it to kill some time. Most of the photos I recognized. Kaylee and I may not have been close, but it was a small town. We shared a lot of the same friends, and there were only a few people we knew who took any pictures worth keeping. There were, however, a couple that were new to me. One showed Kaylee the summer before her freshman year, backpack on her back, sweater tied around her waist, and a wide smile on her face. Her arm was around the shoulder of the boy beside her, who I also recognized. It was Daniel or something that looked like him. A wave of fear swept over me, although I couldn't have said why. The two of them were only 14, too young for those now sinister-seeming camping trips, and there were all sorts of other reasons why they might have been in the woods together. A church-sponsored day hike, family excursions. They looked so close in the photo. Was it during one of those trips that Kaylee had first begun to suspect that something was wrong with Daniel? Or had he even? No, the idea made my blood run cold. Kaylee couldn't be one of them, unless, wouldn't it have made sense to create an enemy figure for Daniel so anyone who suspected him would confide in them first? The water was still running in the bathroom. I stood to check the windows for a second time, but froze when I felt hands on my neck. "You haven't told anyone about this, have you?" Kaylee asked in a sultry voice as she massaged me. No," I admitted uneasily. "Why?" "Oh, that's what I thought. I checked your phone while you were in the bathroom. No messages, no calls in or out." "Kaylee, what's going on?" "This can be as easy or painful as you want it to be. Don't struggle." I would have sworn that there was some other voice beneath the one that I knew, gravelly, ancient, and terribly hungry. The fingers tightened around my windpipe. Vaguely humanoid shapes blotted out the light on the other side of the windows, and I knew that if I didn't act now, there would never be another chance. I lowered my chin and bit down hard on Kaylee's exposed fingers. There was an inhuman hiss. A bitter, blackish-brown liquid oozed into my mouth. Vomit rose in my throat, but my attacker's grip loosened. The window panes lifted with no difficulty. The thing that I called Kaylee had only ever pretended to lock up. The faces of the figures crawling through Kaylee's window were horribly familiar. I scrambled toward the bedroom at the end of the hall, sure that Kaylee would have stationed another one of them outside her front door. Just as I had feared, it swung open a second later, revealing a large figure in a sheriff's hat. "Hold him!" Max Hopewell shouted. I rolled into Kaylee's bedroom and blocked the door with an end table. Kaylee's car keys were on the dresser. I grabbed them, flung open a window, and leapt out onto the dewy grass. As I sprinted, I heard running footsteps behind me. I had a head start, but they were faster than I was. Faster than should have been possible. The parking lot lights rose like towering ghosts out of the fog. I mashed the unlock button on Kaylee's key fob, flung myself into the driver's seat of her sedan, and frantically locked the doors. It didn't even slow them down. I was still trying to jam the key into the ignition when Sheriff Hopewell's nightstick smashed through the window. With his free hand, he reached through the shattered glass and gripped my hair. What terrified me the most was the serene, almost pleasant expression on his face as though he were watching a beautiful sunset rather than dragging a screaming stranger out of a vehicle. The engine finally turned over. Half in and half out of Kaylee's car, I shifted into reverse and stepped on the gas. I rocketed backwards and crashed into another vehicle. The impact had knocked Sheriff Hopewell off of me, but Kaylee and the others were already climbing spider-like onto the car. I spun the wheel frantically and then accelerated. Someone or something fell off of the windshield and cracked gruesomely beneath the tires. The last of my attackers flew free as I bumped across the green space and onto the lonely 2-lane road that led out of town. In the cracked rearview mirror, I could see them rising to their feet, their silhouettes inky black against the parking lot lights, reminded me of the paintings on weathered stone. It was the last that I saw of my hometown. I abandoned Kaylee's car in the parking lot of a bus station in the nearest city, and I bought a one-way ticket back to my life. My real, boring, humdrum life that had nothing to do with horrors that can change their shape or narrow places underground. Sometimes, though, I still think about my old classmates. I wonder whether I should have purchased a rifle and gone into the caves, guns a-blazing, to save what was left of the people that I once knew. It wasn't cowardice that stopped me, or at least it wasn't only cowardice. Was it possible, I wondered, for one of the painted men to become so involved in their disguise, so dedicated to their role that they forgot what they really were? If I went into those caves, wasn't it possible that I might find myself chained to the stone? The moment I stepped into the apartment, it felt right. It was small, yes, but it was mine. After years of moving from one shared space to another, I was ready for something of my own, even if it was just this modest one-bedroom on the outskirts of the city. The rent was reasonable, the area quiet, and best of all, it was a space that I could shape to my liking. No more tiptoeing around roommates' habits or schedules. This place was a fresh start. The building itself was older, maybe from the 1970s, with the usual quirks of an aging structure. The hallway leading to my door smelled faintly of cleaning products and mildew, the paint peeling slightly at the edges, but I figured I could live with it. It added character, I thought. The apartment had a certain charm too. Wooden floors, a decent kitchen, a view of the tree-lined street below. Nothing fancy, but comfortable. The first night after I moved in, I went through the usual ritual of unpacking boxes and arranging furniture. The work was exhausting but satisfying. The routine of it kept my mind occupied, and by the time that I finished, I was too tired to do anything but fall into bed. As I lay there staring up at the ceiling, I could hear the muffled sounds of the building around me, the hum of distant traffic, footsteps from the apartment above, and the occasional creak of the walls settling. It was normal. Old buildings made noise, I reminded myself. That's just how it is. But there was one sound that stood out. It was faint and barely noticeable at first, like a soft, rhythmic pulse. At first, I thought it was coming from outside, maybe from the heating system or plumbing. I turned on my side, trying to ignore it. Moving into a new place can be disorienting, especially when you're not used to the sounds of the building. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted off. The next days were uneventful. I settled into my new routine, going to work, coming home, and slowly making the apartment feel like mine. I found a local cafe down the street, started exploring the neighborhood a bit, and even managed to meet one or two of the neighbors. Everyone was polite, but they kept to themselves. It was exactly what I wanted. Quiet, low-key, and uneventful. But that sound, that faint, rhythmic pulse, it kept coming back. At first, I only noticed it at night, when the apartment was still and there was nothing else to distract me. I'd be lying in bed, trying to relax, and there it was, a steady, almost mechanical rhythm, like breathing. It was faint enough that I could almost ignore it, but persistent enough that once I noticed it, I couldn't unhear it. One night, after a very long day at work, I found myself lying awake again, listening to that sound. It seemed to move, or maybe it was just my imagination, but I could swear that it wasn't coming from one fixed place. It shifted, first near the bedroom and then closer to the living room. But every time I got up to investigate, it stopped. I checked the windows, thinking maybe it was something outside, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. Just the usual sounds of the city, muffled and distant. I started to rationalize it. The building was old after all. Maybe it was something in the walls or the pipes or the ventilation system. I convinced myself that it was something explainable, even though I couldn't quite pinpoint where it was coming from. I told myself that it didn't matter. I just needed to adjust to the quirks of the place. Besides, there was no one else around to notice it, and none of my neighbors had mentioned anything strange. But then one evening, something happened that I couldn't ignore. I had been home for a few hours, scrolling aimlessly on my phone, the faint hum of the TV in the background. The apartment felt cozy, almost comforting, and I was beginning to feel like I was finally settling in. And that's when I heard it again, that same rhythmic sound, but this time it was louder. And for the first time, it seemed to follow me. I got up from the couch, thinking maybe that I could track it down. As I walked from the living room to the kitchen, the sound seemed to shift. It was still faint, but now it was more noticeable, like someone softly exhaling just behind me. I paused, turning around expecting to find something, anything that could explain it. But there was nothing. The apartment was empty, and just as it had always been. Feeling uneasy, I turned on more lights, as if that would somehow drive away the strange sensation. I checked the vents, the windows, even the floorboards, but there was no obvious source for the sound. It wasn't coming from outside, and it wasn't some appliance or a piece of furniture. It just existed. After a while, the sound seemed to fade, leaving me feeling foolish for getting so worked up over something that was probably just the building's plumbing or some other harmless quirk. Still that night, though, I had trouble falling asleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like I was waiting for that sound to come back, waiting to hear it again. In the following days, I tried to put it out of my mind. I threw myself into work, met up with friends, and did anything that I could to avoid being alone in that apartment for too long. But no matter how busy I kept myself, that feeling of unease lingered. The sound didn't go away. It was always there, just at the edge of my awareness, especially at night. And then one evening, while I was in the middle of cooking dinner, I heard it again. Clearer this time, as if somebody was standing right behind me, breathing steadily just out of sight. I stopped what I was doing, heart racing, and I turned slowly, expecting to find someone or something standing in the doorway. But again, the room was empty. This time, though, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. This wasn't just the pipes or the walls. Something about the way the sound seemed to follow me was too specific, too deliberate. I turned off the stove, grabbed my phone, and stepped outside for some air. For the first time since moving in, I felt genuinely unnerved. And that's when I decided that I had to find out what was really going on in this apartment. It wasn't like me to get spooked. I wasn't the type to believe in ghosts or paranormal nonsense, and I had never been prone to anxiety or overthinking things. But ever since that night when the sound seemed to follow me from room to room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off in the apartment. Rationally, I kept telling myself that there was an explanation. Every old building had its quirks, right? Maybe it was the ventilation system, or maybe the walls were thinner than I thought, and I was just hearing the neighbors' movements somehow. But it wasn't just the sound itself. It was the feeling that came with it. A sensation that wasn't easy to describe. Like being observed when you know no one else is there. I started wondering if my mind was playing tricks on me, but the sound was so consistent, so steady. It didn't feel like something that I was imagining. And the next day at work, I decided to do some digging. During my lunch break, I searched online for anything about strange noises in apartments. And there was the usual results. Old buildings settling, faulty pipes, drafts, and poorly insulated walls. But nothing that matched the specific rhythmic pattern that I was hearing. I kept digging, reading through forums and articles, but I still came up with nothing definitive. I was beginning to think that I was alone in this, that it was just some weird thing about the apartment that I would have to live with. But something in me just couldn't let it go. That evening when I got home, I decided that I would try and trace the source of the sound more methodically. It started almost on cue. As soon as the apartment settled into its evening quiet, there it was. That soft, rhythmic pulse, like somebody was breathing in the background. I stood in the center of the living room trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. It felt louder tonight, or maybe I was just more attuned to it. Either way, it seemed to be everywhere and nowhere all at once. I started walking around the apartment, pausing every few steps to listen. The sound didn't get louder or softer, but it always seemed to be nearby, no matter where I stood. I checked the vents, leaning in close, trying to detect anything that might be causing it, but there was nothing. I pressed my ear against the walls, half expecting to hear a neighbor's TV or a conversation, but all I could hear was the steady pulse. Growing more frustrated, I moved into the kitchen and turned off all the appliances. Maybe the refrigerator or the microwave was emitting some kind of sound that I hadn't noticed before. But when everything was off, the sound was still there, unchanged. It wasn't mechanical. It was too soft, too human. Next, I decided to check the windows again. I opened each one, listening for any street noise, but the sound didn't seem to be coming from outside. I even went so far as to stand in the hallway outside my apartment, wondering if it was something in the building itself. But as soon as I closed the door behind me, the noise disappeared, leaving only the usual hum of the building. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the stale hallway air, trying to think of what to do next. I felt ridiculous. It was just a sound after all. But the longer that it persisted, the more it seemed like something that I needed to figure out. Not just because it was unsettling, but because I couldn't let it go. I couldn't live with this constant, unnerving presence in my home. Back inside, I resumed my search, this time moving into the bedroom. It was the one place that I hadn't fully checked yet, mostly because I dreaded the idea that the sound might be the strongest where I slept. I stood in the middle of the room listening intently, and there it was again, faint but steady, like it had been all along. I crouched down, checking under the bed, and even though I knew there was nothing there, The floorboards creaked slightly as I shifted my weight, but that rhythmic pulse remained constant. I moved toward the closet next, pulling the door open and rifling through my clothes and boxes, but there was nothing unusual. No hidden vents, no odd wiring, nothing. I sat down on the edge of the bed, staring blankly at the wall and feeling defeated. I had tried everything, and yet the sound persisted, as if it was mocking my attempts to understand it. And then I realized something. I had been trying to track it down physically, like it was a problem that I could solve by moving things around or turning off devices. But what if it wasn't something inside the apartment? What if it was something in the apartment's history? The thought made my skin prickle. I didn't like the direction that my mind was going, but I couldn't ignore the fact that nothing that I had done so far had made a difference. I grabbed my laptop and sat at the kitchen table, determined to find out more about the building. It didn't take long to track down basic information. The building was constructed in the early 70s as I had suspected, and it had gone through several ownership changes over the years. But what caught my attention was an article buried deep in an old local news archive. The headline read, "Body discovered weeks after tenant's death in local apartment." My heart skipped a beat as I clicked on the link. The article was brief, a few paragraphs detailing how the body of a middle-aged man had been found in his apartment several weeks after he had passed away. Neighbors had complained about a smell, leading the landlord to enter the unit. By then, the body had decomposed and the man had been dead for nearly a month. I read on, my eyes scanning for details. The article didn't mention which unit the man had lived in, but it did say that the building's ventilation system had been faulty at the time, which had delayed the discovery of the body. For weeks, the man's decomposing body had been releasing gases into the air, and it wasn't until the smell became overwhelming that anybody realized something was wrong. I sat there staring at the screen, my mind racing. Could it be? Could the strange sound I was hearing be connected to that? It seemed far-fetched, but at the same time, it was the only thing that made any sense. The ventilation system, the pipes, it had to be something left over from that, right? Some lingering effect of the tragedy that had taken place in the building all those years ago. But even as I tried to convince myself that it was a rational explanation, the thought of it unsettled me deeply. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this, something that I wasn't seeing yet. And as I sat there, the rhythmic sound continued, steady and unrelenting. It was as if the apartment itself was breathing. After reading that article, I couldn't shake the image of the decomposing tenant from my mind. It was disturbing enough that somebody had died alone in this building and had remained undiscovered for weeks. But what really gnawed at me was the possibility that I had moved into that very same apartment. The sound that I had been hearing, like somebody breathing, had felt all too connected to the story. The next morning, I decided to take things further. I wasn't satisfied with what I had learned online. I needed to know for sure if this apartment had been the site of that tragedy. I also wanted to know more about who that man had been. Was there something about him that might explain the strange presence that I was feeling? My first step was to visit the building's property management office. I figured they wouldn't give me detailed information about former tenants, but I hoped they might at least tell me more about the apartment itself. I had never met the landlord personally, only dealt with the office staff when signing my lease, but I was determined to get some answers. I walked over to the office, a small, unimpressive space tucked behind the main building. The receptionist at the front desk glanced up as I entered, giving me the bored, detached look of somebody who had dealt with too many tenant complaints. I cleared my throat and tried to sound casual. "Hi, I live in apartment 6B, I said, leaning on the counter. "I was wondering if you could tell me anything about the history of the unit. I'm just curious about who lived there before me. She frowned slightly, typing something into her computer. Is there a problem with the unit? She asked without looking up. Oh, no, no problem, I replied, though I could hear the nervousness creeping into my voice. I heard something about the building's ventilation system being an issue a while back, and I was curious if it affected my apartment. I like to know the history of places that I live in, you know. The receptionist hesitated, her fingers still hovering over the keyboard. The building's old, she said, in a tone that suggested she didn't want to deal with whatever concern I might bring up next. Oh, there have been repairs over the years, sure, but we take care of any major issues. If you're having a problem, I can send maintenance. I shook my head quickly. Oh, no, it's not that, it's just, was there ever an incident in that apartment? Like, did something happen to a former tenant? Her eyes flickered with something like recognition. She glanced at the screen in front of her again and then back up at me, her expression guarded. I'm not really supposed to share details about previous tenants, she said slowly, choosing her words carefully. But there was an incident. It was a long time ago. I leaned in, my curiosity growing. An incident? What kind? The receptionist glanced around, as if checking to see if anybody else was listening, and then lowering her voice, she said, A man passed away in the apartment a few years ago. Natural causes, I believe, but he wasn't found for a while. There is an issue with the ventilation system at the time, and she trailed off, clearly uncomfortable discussing it further. So it was true. My stomach twisted as I realized I had been right. I was living in the same apartment where that man had died. I thanked the receptionist and left the office, my mind racing. I had the confirmation that I needed, but it didn't make me feel any better. In fact, it only made things worse. The idea that I had been hearing something connected to that man or to his death was too unsettling to ignore now. I couldn't just write it off as pipes or ventilation noises anymore. There was a connection between the sound and the history of the place, even if I couldn't fully explain it yet. Back in the apartment, I found myself more aware than ever of the space around me. Every corner, every wall felt heavy with the knowledge of what had happened here. I tried to keep myself busy, telling myself that it was all in my head. But the sound was there again that night, steady again as if something was lingering just beneath the surface of normal life. That night, I barely slept. My thoughts kept returning back to that article, to what the receptionist had confirmed. I found myself wondering about the man who had died here. Who was he? How had he ended up alone and unnoticed for so long? I tried to picture his final moments. Did he know that he was going to die? Had he tried to call for help? But no one heard him. And the next morning, I decided that I needed more information. I had to understand the full story. I couldn't keep living in this apartment with these half-formed suspicions lurking in the back of my mind. And so I turned back to the internet, this time searching more specifically for details about the man's death. It took a while, but I eventually found a few more references to the incident. The man's name was Michael Harris. He had been in his late 50s, lived alone, and from what I could gather, had no close family or friends nearby. His death had gone unnoticed for weeks, and by the time the building staff had discovered him, his body had already begun to decompose. The article mentioned that neighbors had complained about the smell, but it wasn't until the stench became overwhelming that anybody had thought to check on him. Reading about Michael Harris sent a chill through me. The idea of dying alone with nobody there to care or notice was horrifying in itself. But something about the way the article described the discovery of his body stuck with me. It mentioned that the ventilation system had been pumping air from his apartment into the rest of the building, which was why it had taken so long for anyone to realize something was wrong. I thought back to the sound that I had been hearing. That breathing like pulse. Could it really be that simple? Was I hearing something left over from that faulty ventilation thing? Maybe it wasn't supernatural after all. Maybe it was just the remnants of old air, trapped in the ducts, still circulating through the building. But even as I considered that explanation, I couldn't shake the sense that there was more to it. I couldn't ignore how specific the sound felt, how it seemed to follow me, to shift in intensity depending on where I was in the apartment. It wasn't just an ambient noise. It felt alive. And that evening I made a decision. I couldn't live like this, constantly wondering and second-guessing myself. I needed to confront whatever was happening once and for all. I waited until nightfall when the apartment was at its quietest, and then I sat in the living room listening. The sound was there as always, soft but present. I focused on it, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. It was faint at first, but after a few minutes, it grew louder and more distinct. I stood up and began to follow it, moving slowly through the apartment, from the living room to the kitchen and then back to the bedroom. It seemed to move with me just as it had before. But this time I wasn't going to let it scare me. I was going to face it head on. And then as I stood in the doorway of the bedroom, something strange happened. The sound stopped. Complete silence filled the room. And for the first time, I felt truly alone in my apartment. That silence was heavier than any noise that I had ever heard. It pressed against me, thick and suffocating, as if the absence of the sound was more oppressive than its presence had ever been. I stood in the bedroom doorway frozen, waiting for the pulse of that noise to return. But it didn't. Instead, there was nothing, just the quiet hum of the city outside, muffled and distant. I tried to tell myself that this was a good thing. Maybe I had finally figured it out, or maybe the sound was just some odd quirk of the building that had now resolved itself. But deep down I knew that it wasn't over. Something had shifted in the apartment, and the silence wasn't a relief. It was a warning. That night I barely slept again, but it wasn't the sound keeping me awake this time. It was the lack thereof it. The way the apartment felt unnaturally still, like it was holding its breath. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to rationalize everything that had happened. The more I thought about it, the more the pieces didn't quite fit together. The ventilation system theory seemed plausible enough, but why had the sound felt so personal? Why had it followed me, or at least seemed to? By the time morning came, I was exhausted and jittery, unable to shake the unease that clung to me. I went through my day at work in a fog, barely able to even focus. My mind kept drifting back to the apartment, to that silent, unsettling space that I had left behind. I considered calling someone, maybe a friend or even a professional, just to get another perspective. But what would I say? Hey, I think my apartment might be haunted, but don't worry, it's probably just bad ventilation. I knew how ridiculous it sounded, and I wasn't about to embarrass myself over something that I couldn't even explain properly. When I got home that evening, I half expected the sound to be waiting for me, picking up right where it had left off. But as I opened the door, I was greeted with the same thick silence. The apartment, it felt different now, not just quiet, but empty in a way that it hadn't been before. I set my keys on the counter, listening for any hint of the familiar noise, but all I heard was the faint hum of the refrigerator. I tried to settle into my usual routine, cooking dinner, watching TV, but everything felt off. Every creak of the floorboards made me jump. Every little noise from outside the window felt like an intrusion. I was on edge, constantly waiting for the sound to come back, for the rhythm to start up again, but it didn't. The apartment remained silent, and with every passing hour, my anxiety grew. And that night, as I lay in bed, I finally allowed myself to consider the possibility that something else might be going on. Something beyond faulty pipes or old ductwork. I didn't want to believe it. I'm not the type of person who jumps to supernatural conclusions. But the strange consistency of the sound, its almost deliberate movements, and the way that it had stopped so suddenly, it all made me wonder if there was something more. Something tied to the man who had died here, to Michael Harris. I thought about him a lot that night, imagining what his life had been like, what his final days had been like. Alone in this very apartment, unnoticed by anyone. I wondered if he had felt the same sense of isolation that I was feeling now, if he had heard the same noises, or if this was something new, something connected to his death or maybe even to me. The more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. Eventually, exhaustion took over and I drifted into a fitful sleep, but it wasn't a restful sleep. My dreams were disjointed, full of fragmented images. Michael Harris's face, the empty hallways of the building, the rhythmic pulse of that sound echoing in the background. In one of the dreams, I was standing in the middle of the apartment, listening and waiting for the sound to start. But instead of hearing it, I saw it, ripples moving through the air like invisible waves. And in the middle of those ripples was a figure, standing perfectly still and watching me. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, the apartment still dark and silent around me. I lay there disoriented, trying to shake the feeling of the dream, but it clung to me. The figure, the ripples, it felt too real and too vivid. I rubbed my eyes and glanced at the clock. It was just after 3 a.m. That's when I heard it. It started quietly at first, so faint that I almost thought that I was imagining it. But as I lay there holding my breath, it grew louder. That same pulse, steady and soft, just like before. It was back. I sat up in bed, my heart racing again, and I listened. The sound wasn't coming from the bedroom this time, it was coming from the living room. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood up, moving slowly toward the door. The sound grew louder as I got closer, still soft, but now unmistakable. It was as if somebody was standing just beyond the living room, breathing slowly and deliberately. I stepped into the hallway, my feet moving almost on their own. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it, but nothing added up. I wasn't scared exactly, but I was tense, every muscle in my body on high alert. I told myself that I was going to confront it. Whatever it was, there had to be an explanation. As I reached the living room, the sound seemed to shift, like it was moving once again, just beyond the edge of my awareness. I stopped in the middle of the room, standing perfectly still, and I listened. The pulse was steady now and louder than before, but still soft enough that it felt distant, like it was coming from just beyond the walls. And then as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped again. I stood there in the middle of the living room, surrounded by silence, my breath shallow and my pulse racing. I didn't know what to do. I had no idea where the sound had gone or why it had stopped. All I knew was that it had come back, and this time it felt different, more deliberate and more aware. I glanced around the room, searching for anything out of place, but everything looked normal. Just my furniture and my belongings, the same space that I had been living in for weeks. But something had changed. I could feel it in the air, in the way the silence seemed to press against me, almost suffocating. I was no longer alone in the apartment. I backed slowly out of the living room, retreating to the hallway, my eyes scanning the space around me. Every instinct told me to leave, to get out of the apartment and figure this out from a safe distance, but I didn't move. I couldn't. Something was keeping me there, holding me in place, as if I needed to see this through, to find out what was really happening. I stood in the hallway for what felt like an eternity, listening, waiting for that sound to return, but it didn't. The silence remained thick and heavy, wrapping around me like a blanket. And then, just as I was about to turn and go back to bed, I heard something new. It wasn't the sound this time. It was a soft creak, like a floorboard shifting under the weight of something. Or someone. I turned slowly, my heart in my throat, and I saw it. There in the doorway of the bedroom stood a figure. It was faint, almost like a shadow, but it was there, unmoving and watching me. For the first time since this whole thing started, I felt real fear. The kind of fear that grips you so tightly that you can't move, you can't think, you can't breathe. And in that moment I knew, whatever had been making that sound wasn't just in the walls. It was here with me. For a moment I couldn't move. I stood frozen in the hallway, staring at the figure in the bedroom doorway. My brain struggled to process what I was seeing, to fit it into the realm of reality, but nothing about this felt real. The figure was just standing there, barely more than a shadow, its shape indistinct but unmistakably human. Every rational part of me wanted to believe that it was a trick of the light, a figment of my sleep-deprived mind. Maybe I was still dreaming, caught in the fog of that strange half-sleep state where everything feels off but plausible. But this wasn't a dream. The figure didn't move, but its presence was palpable. Like the weight of eyes on you when somebody's staring, that invisible pressure in the air that makes your skin crawl. I took a step back, my breath coming in shallow, uneven bursts, trying to force myself to think clearly. I should have run. I should have turned and bolted out of the apartment, but my legs, they didn't cooperate. Fear had a grip on me now, squeezing tighter with every second that passed. My mind raced through possibilities, desperate for an explanation, an intruder, a shadow, a reflection, but none of them made sense. I blinked hard, my vision blurring slightly as I did, and for a split second, the figure seemed to waver, almost like it wasn't fully solid, but it was still there and still watching. A sudden thought hit me like a bolt of lightning. Michael Harris. Was this him? Was this what was left behind, lingering in the apartment after his death? The rational part of me recoiled at the idea, but after everything that had happened, the sound, the strange feelings, the way the apartment seemed to change, it was hard to shake. The figure had to be connected to him. There was no other explanation. I stood there in shock, struggling to find the nerve to react. After what felt like forever, I finally pushed myself to say something. "Who are you?" My voice came out quieter than I'd intended, barely more than a croak, but it was enough to break the silence. The figure didn't move, didn't respond, it just stood there, a dark shape in the doorway like it was waiting for something. The stillness of it was almost worse than if it had moved. There was something unnatural about how it just remained motionless without a sound. I took another step back, my legs shaking. My mind screamed at me to get out, to run, but I couldn't bring myself to turn away. Something about this moment felt final, like I had reached the point of no return. I needed to know what this was, what had been haunting me ever since I had moved in. I forced myself to speak again, louder this time, trying to keep my voice steady. "Are you Michael Harris?" The second that the name left my lips, the figure shifted. It was subtle, just a slight tilt of the head, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. The name had meant something. I felt it, like the air in the room had suddenly changed, like a weight had lifted or maybe shifted. The figure still didn't speak, but its attention was unmistakable. It was as if I had acknowledged something that had been waiting to be seen. My heart hammered in my chest, and I couldn't tell if I was more terrified or relieved. Terrified because whatever this was, it had just responded to me. Relieved because at least now I knew I wasn't losing my mind. I hadn't been imagining the strange noises. the sense of being watched. This thing, this presence, it had been here all along. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. If this was Michael Harris, if this was some remnant of his life, then maybe there was a way to help him. Maybe he was stuck here lingering in the apartment, unable to move on because nobody had noticed him in life, and now nobody was paying attention in death. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Why are you here?" The figure didn't move again, but the air around me felt charged, like the space was holding its breath. I realized then that the sound that I had been hearing, the rhythmic breathing like pulse, it had completely stopped. The apartment was silent, as if everything had gone still, waiting for something to happen. I took another step back, and as I did, the figure seemed to fade slightly, as if it were being pulled away. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes again, it was gone. The doorway was empty. I stood there trembling, trying to process what had just happened. My mind raced, replaying the encounter over and over, trying to make sense of it. I had seen it, I had seen something, but now it was gone, leaving me alone in the quiet apartment. I wasn't sure how long I stood there, staring at the empty space where the figure had been, but eventually my legs gave out and I sank onto the couch, my hands shaking. The adrenaline that had been coursing through me drained away, leaving me exhausted and confused. What had I just experienced? Was that really Michael Harris? Was I imagining things, or was this apartment truly haunted by some lingering presence? I didn't sleep that night, I couldn't. Every creak of the floor, every shift of light had me on edge, waiting for that thing to return. But it didn't. The apartment stayed quiet, as if whatever had been haunting me had finally gone. The next morning, I made a decision. I couldn't stay here any longer. Whatever was in this apartment, whatever had been following me, I didn't want to find out any more than I already had. I packed my things in a frenzy, barely stopping to think, throwing clothes and belongings into bags as quickly as I could. As I walked out of the building for the last time, I didn't look back. I couldn't. All I knew was that I needed to get as far away from that place as possible. It's been a few months since I left the apartment, and I still think about it sometimes. About the figure, about the sound, about Michael Harris. I don't know what it was that I saw or why it was there, but I do know one thing. Some places hold on to the past in ways that we can't explain. And sometimes the past doesn't want to be forgotten. I moved to a new apartment across town, one with bright windows and modern fixtures, a place that feels fresh and clean. I haven't heard any strange sounds here, no rhythmic pulses or mysterious figures watching me from doorways. Life has returned to normal, or at least as normal as it can be after an experience like that. But sometimes late at night when everything is still and quiet, I can't help but listen just to make sure. And every so often I think I hear something, a faint steady sound, like someone breathing. The blizzard was supposed to last 2 days, and then 2 became 3. Then I was on day 4 holed up in my cabin. The only thing I could see outside was the snow, a white, shifting void that obscured the rest of the mountain range. I looked for the stars out of habit, but they were gone, buried behind layers of storm. The sky was black, thick with cloud and snow in the night. The tree line, usually clear, was faint now. A smudge of darkness barely separated nature from the cabin. The thick snow blurred the edges, turning trees into shadows that shifted with the wind. What had once been a sharp, familiar boundary was now lost in the white of the snow and the darkness of the night. I was ready, at least, before the storm hit. I had driven down the mountain to the nearby town to stock up on supplies, like I always do. I filled my good old F-150 with food, water, and anything else that I might need to ride out the worst of it. Back at the clearing of the cabin, I chopped firewood. I have already got enough stacked to last through a second ice age, but it gives me something to do. Something to break up the quiet. All aspects of it. The rhythmic thunk of the axe hitting wood. The smell of fresh pine. The way the pile grows bigger with every swing. It all keeps me from thinking too much. I don't get visitors. That's not me being dramatic, it's just fact. The nearest neighbor is a 40-minute drive down the mountain, and that's when the roads are clear, which they're not. They haven't been for days. That's why when I heard a knock, I nearly dropped the mug of cocoa that I was holding. It wasn't loud, just two slow, deliberate raps on the door. And then nothing. I stood there in the kitchen for a few seconds, just listening, waiting to hear it again. The storm was still going strong outside, but underneath the wind, the silence settled again like a blanket. Neither a knock nor a voice calling out followed. I figured that I had imagined it. Cabin fever and all that, it wouldn't be the first time. But I walked to the door anyway. Something in me wouldn't let it go. Could have been curiosity, or maybe I was just so starved for company that I wanted there to be somebody out there. I opened the door and there he was. A kid in his early 20s maybe. He could have passed for a college student if he wasn't half frozen. His face was pale as paper, lips blue, eyes wide and glassy like he wasn't there at all. Snow clung to his coat in heavy clumps, and he was shaking so hard his teeth were clacking together. God, I said before I even thought about it. He didn't answer, didn't even look at me, just stood there trembling in the doorway like he didn't know where he was. I should have hesitated, should have asked what he was doing out in a blizzard, who he was and how he got up here. But I didn't. If I closed the door and he died out there, I would never be able to live with myself. That part of me, the part that used to be a husband, the part that could have been a father one day, it's still there somewhere, even if it's quieter now. Come in, I said. Come on, let's get you warm. He stepped inside without a word. The wind slammed the door shut behind him. He left a trail of melting snow behind him as I led him to the fire. His boots were soaked through. I had him sit on the old armchair by the hearth while I threw a couple logs on and got the flames high. I asked if he was hurt. He didn't answer. Can you talk? I tried again. Tell me your name. Still nothing. Just that 1,000-yard stare like he was looking through the fire, past it. Like he saw something there that I couldn't. He looked like hell, skin pale and tight over the bone, lips cracked, nose bleeding just a little from the cold. I knelt down beside him and checked for frostbite, and that's when I saw it. On his side, and just below the ribs, his jacket torn and shirt soaked with blood, was a wound, a deep bite. Ragged, raw, and dirty, turning dark around the edges. It wasn't new. A day old, maybe more. The skin around it was red and hot. You didn't say you were bit, I muttered, more to myself than to him. He flinched when I touched it. First reaction that I had gotten out of him. His eyes snapped to mine, wild, just for a second, and then they went vacant again. It didn't look like a wolf bite. I had seen those before. Hell, I've seen worse, back when I hunted more often. Wolves tear, rip, and pull. This was cleaner, too clean. I patched it up as best I could, cleaned it, wrapped gauze tight around his ribs. He winced but didn't make a sound, just watched me breathing shallow, like a cornered animal. After that, I set him up in the guest room. It had a bed, a thick blanket, and a space heater in the corner. He didn't say a word and just laid down, curled in on himself, eyes still wide open. I left him there and closed the door gently behind him. The cabin felt smaller after that, like he brought something in with him. A weight, a shift in the air. I tried to shake it. I made myself tea, sat by the fire, and held a book in my lap that I didn't read. I checked on him an hour later. He was asleep, out cold. No fever, at least none that I could feel. I left the door cracked, just in case. I must have nodded off at some point. The fire was down to coals when I woke up, house quiet as a grave. I could hear the wind screaming against the windows, the old trees creaking out front, but nothing inside. No footsteps, no coughing, no movement from the guest room. I was just about to check again when I heard the floorboard creak. He was standing in the hall just watching me. "Jesus," I said, nearly spilling my tea. He blinked, slow, looked around like he wasn't sure where he was. "Sorry," he said, voice hoarse and dry. "I didn't mean to scare you." "It's all right," I said. "You're lucky to be alive. What the hell were you doing up here?" He scratched at his bandage. "Hiking," he said, "with my girlfriend, Emma." I waited. "We were camping in the woods yesterday, no, a few nights before. Got caught up in the storm. Thought we'd hunker down and ride it out." He stopped, his jaw tightened. "We heard something. Outside the tent, I thought it was wolves. Big ones. We stayed quiet, didn't move, but it didn't matter. They tore through the side." He swallowed hard, eyes wet now, but not crying. "I ran. I didn't even see what they looked like, just teeth. It was wrong, there were too many of them." Emma screamed and then his voice broke off. "You didn't see her after that?" He shook his head. "I ran until I couldn't, and then I saw your cabin." "Hey, you're safe now, kid. Just rest." He nodded, turned, and walked back to the guest room like he was sleepwalking. I had tried going back to sleep, even poured myself another mug of cocoa just to have something warm in my hands. But the air felt heavier now, like it was pressing in on me 1 inch at a time. Sometime after midnight, I heard the floor creak. I glanced up, expecting to see him again, maybe wandering the hall confused, but there was no one. Just the faint sound of the bathroom door clicking shut at the end of the hall. The light spilled out in a thin line under the frame. I waited 5 minutes and then 10. The pipes groaned once. A long, low exhale like the cabin itself was holding its breath. And then I heard glass break. I walked to the bathroom and cleared my throat loud enough for him to hear. No response. "You all right in there?" Still nothing. The steam started seeping out from under the door, slow and crawling, hugging the floor like smoke. It looked off, not sharp and white like a shower usually gives off. This was thicker, heavier, and gray around the edges, like breath fogged on glass. I stood outside for another minute and then stepped closer. I pressed my knuckles to the door and knocked once, gently. "You hear me, son?" Silence. Not even the shuffle of movement. No cough, no running water. The wood felt cold beneath my hand. Not warm like it should be with steam coming through, just still and dead and cold. I leaned in, pressed my ear to the door, and I listened. Nothing. Every instinct in me said, walk away, just let it be. The boy had been through hell. Maybe he needed time. Maybe he was sick. Maybe he just broke the mirror by accident. Maybe I was imagining things again. But my gut had gone cold and it wasn't from the storm. I wrapped my hand around the knob. It was slick with condensation. I turned it slowly, as quiet as I could, until the latch gave way with a soft click. And then, holding my breath, I gently opened the door. What I saw shook me. The kid was split open vertically down the middle, bisected with a horrific precision that ran from the crown of his head, through his nose, mouth, and sternum, all the way down to his groin. The bathroom looked like a butcher's block, the tiled floor underneath stained with something dark and moist. His two halves rested on the floor like broken mannequins, separated by a sickening foot of space. Ribs, stark white and splintered, jutted like snapped fences. Muscles still glistening and unnervingly pink hung in strips. The coiled lengths of intestine and the dull spilled organs lay exposed and motionless on the floor, some still clinging to one half of the body. There was an emptiness where his spine should have been, a hollowed-out canyon running through his core. It was as if something massive had forced its way out from the inside. The precision of the split through bone and gristle was alien. It was wrong. And then, through the haze of shock, a draft hit me. A bone-deep cold that had nothing to do with the storm outside. My eyes, still wide and unfocused, slowly tracked it. The small bathroom window, usually sealed tight against the mountain air, was shattered. Not just cracked, but exploded outward, as if something had exited through it. Jagged shards of glass glittered on the sill and floor. The fierce wind howled through the gap, bringing with it a stinging spray of snow. And from the half of the young man's body that was closer to a window, a trail began. A glistening, repulsive path of black and dark red slime snaked across the pristine white tiles, past the gurgling toilet, over the shattered glass, and through the broken window frame, disappearing into the white void of the blizzard. I thought it was blood, but it was thick, viscous, and it seemed to pulsate faintly in the dim light, leaving an oily sheen in its wake. Whatever had been inside him, whatever had ripped him apart and then fled, had left this horrifying signature. I finally found my breath. It was a cold, panicked gasp that tasted of iron and the strange stink coming off the floor. I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off the split halves, off the black and red trail that snaked across the tiles. Every instinct screamed run. Not down the mountain, I would never make it, but away from this room. It was out there now. Something that hid inside a man and that discarded the skin to crawl through a broken window into a night that would kill anything normal. The thought of it sliding down the mountain, of it reaching the small, defenseless town that I had just driven through days ago, made adrenaline surge through paralysis. It couldn't make it to town. Not on my watch. My feet moved before my brain gave the order. I didn't bother closing the bathroom door. The horror had already escaped. I moved past the living room where the cozy glow of the dying fire felt like a cruel joke, and into the master bedroom. I went straight to the closet. Tucked behind my winter gear, right where I always kept it, was a Remington 870. I pulled it out, the cold steel of the pump action a familiar weight in my hands. I grabbed the box of double-aught buckshot from the shelf, spilling a handful of crimson shells onto the carpet, but I didn't stop to pick them up. I loaded the shotgun quickly, the sharp, metallic clink of the shells cutting through the roar of the wind. It had been years since I had pointed a gun at anything that wasn't a deer, but looking at the slick, dark trail leading out of my house, I knew this wasn't hunting a living being. This was stopping something that was already dead, something that had worn death and then shed it. I wasn't a hero. I was just a widower with a cabin, a shotgun, and a terrifying realization. I was the last line of defense. The storm that had trapped me had trapped it too on the mountain. I held the shotgun steady, my knuckles white. The wind howled outside, the trees creaked. I checked the hall one last time, glanced at the horror show of the bathroom, and then I moved toward the front door. There was no plan. There was only the gun in my hands, a worry in my heart, and the knowledge that something sinister was crawling through the snow toward civilization. I flipped the deadbolt and hit the door with my shoulder. The wind was a physical blow, a sudden blinding white sheet that stole my breath and stung my eyes. The roar of the storm swallowed the world around. It was a complete whiteout. My eyes searched frantically for the trail. The front porch was already buried under a fresh drift, but I knelt down, shielding my face against the immediate sting of the snow. There it was, still outside the bathroom window on the other side of the perimeter. The oily black and crimson slime was already freezing, but it hadn't been buried yet. It was distinct, lying on the otherwise clean snow like spilled ink. It didn't just drip, it looked like something had slithered. I followed it, sinking immediately into the drifts up to my knees. The air was so cold that it burned my lungs. I kept the Remington high. Its barrel was a dark, steady presence against the blinding white. The trail, growing in width as I followed it, led past the woodpile and headed directly for the tree line. The trees themselves were black specters against the night, swaying and groaning under the weight of the snow. I fought against the resistance of the deep snow, pushing myself faster, driven by the metallic reek of the slime that, even in the freezing air, seemed to linger. I was maybe 20 yards from the cabin, battling a sudden heavy gust when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a buck, driven mad by the storm. It was easily that size, low to the ground, its dark shape barely discernible in the whirling vortex of snow, where the cabin's clearing met the forest edge. But it didn't move like a deer. It didn't trot or bound, it scuttled. It was hunkered down, its massive body creating a brief moment of stillness in the blizzard, a small black shadow against the white fury. I stopped dead, sinking deeper into the drift. I raised the shotgun, pushing the safety off with a dry click. Through the shifting veil of snow, I strained to make out details, and the details that I found were strange. It was hairy, thick black fur matted and clotted. The fur was plastered down in clumps, matted thick with the same crimson slime that lined the floor of my bathroom. Its bulk seemed to be expanding, the hair giving it an immense, distorted volume, but the low, hunched posture suggested that it was something that preferred to crawl. It had multiple limbs, too many, working in sync to move it along the ground. Thick jointed appendages that glistened unnervingly. The sight was a sickening contradiction. The heavy dense covering of fur mixed with the raw, unnatural sheen of the slime. It looked like a living, wet wound covered in an animal's coat. And then it lifted something, its head. I realized with a shudder of pure dread. It was impossibly large and angular, but I couldn't discern a face. And then the wind cleared the snow just enough for me to see a flash of wet, sickly red where eyes or a mouth should have been, reflecting the distant, faint light from my cabin window. It didn't see me. It seemed focused entirely on the darkness of the tree line, already beginning to merge with the shadows. It was moving still low and fast, dragging its huge, repulsive body away from the cabin and toward the mountain pass that led to town. I gripped the shotgun, ignoring the trembling of my own body. The blizzard had made the shot difficult, but the distance was short. If I let it reach the shelter of the trees, it would be gone. I took the slack out of the trigger. There was no hesitation left in me, just the immediate, primal need to stop this monstrosity before it vanished. I squeezed the trigger. The sound of the Remington going off was deafening, a violent boom that shattered the stillness of the storm. The flash of the muzzle momentarily burned the image of the creature into my retina. I felt the powerful kick of the shotgun against my shoulder, and a split second later, the buckshot slammed into the creature's massive torso. It didn't go down. Instead, the thing let out a sound that cut right through the howling wind, a screaming wail that was entirely inorganic, like tearing metal on a wet, ripping canvas. It was a noise of pain, but also of inhuman rage, and it sent a spike of pure terror through my chest. The section of its body where the shot hit seemed to absorb the impact, scattering the spray of the thick dark slime and a few clumps of matted hair into the air. It scrambled, the monstrous body, for all its bulk, moved with terrifying speed, abandoning the relatively clear ground and lunging into the dense black of the tree line. I pumped the action, ejecting the spent shell, and loaded a fresh round. I didn't wait to see if it was mortally wounded. I just knew that I had to keep it moving, keep it from burrowing down or reaching the pass. I plunged into the forest after it, following the fresh, dark disturbance in the snow. The trees offered a brief, deceptive shield from the worst of the wind, but the snow was deeper here, making every step a labor. I focused only on the trail, the churned snow, the scattered slime, the deep, heavy indentations of its multiple limbs. I ran until my lungs burned, until the cold made the skin on my face ache, until the sound of its desperate, laborious breathing were drowned out by my own. And then I stopped. The trail vanished. One moment I was following a distinct line of destruction. The next, the snow was pristine, only marked by my own clumsy boot prints. I moved forward a few more steps, scanning the blizzard-shrouded ground, wondering if the heavy snow had worked against me and buried the signs. But no, the trail hadn't slowly faded. It had ended completely, as if the creature had simply dissolved into the air. I rotated slowly, the shotgun trembling slightly in my grip, my eyes uselessly searching the area around me. My breath hitched. I caught it only as an indistinct smear of shadow, a sudden movement in my peripheral vision, high above me. I tilted my head back, staring up into the shifting, wind-whipped canopy of the pines. There was no ground trail because the trail had continued up. The dark, oily slime wasn't on the snow anymore. It was smeared high on the bark of the nearest trees, running in sickening vertical streaks. The monster hadn't been slowed. It had simply used the vertical space the forest had offered. It had the high ground. It was above, hidden by the night and the dense pine needles, and I was exposed beneath it. My heart hammered against my ribs. I had gone from the hunter to the obvious, slow-moving target. I scanned the dark trunks of the nearest pines, searching for any break, any shelter that might afford me a moment of cover. About 10 feet away, a massive ancient pine had been partially uprooted long ago, its gnarled root system exposed. The dirt and thick woody roots had formed a dark, protective cave against the elements. I dove toward it, dropping to my hands and knees in the snow. I wedged myself into the space beneath the largest root, pulling the shotgun close to my chest. My back pressed against the cold, frozen earth. I held perfectly still, straining my ears against the wind, forcing myself to shrink into the shadows and the earth. It was silent again, save for the storm. The vast black space between the high branches and the low earth was now where the true danger lay. I looked up through an opening in the uplifted roots. seeing only the tangled darkness. I waited for a drop of slime, a tremor of a branch, or the silent, horrifying moment when that massive, hairy, glistening shape would descend. I stayed perfectly still, trying to slow the panicked rush of my breath. The silence, punctuated only by the wind, was unbearable. The creature was somewhere above, hunting for the man that had just fired the loud, disruptive weapon. And then the snow began to sift down, not from the storm but from the branches above. Chunks fell, followed by a sudden heavy thud just yards away. It had dropped. The creature was on the ground again, but now it wasn't scrambling away, it was waddling. A fast, deliberate, low-to-the-earth movement, like a massive, glistening insect trying to appear harmless. Its bulk seemed even more immense now that it was no longer distorted by the heights, and I could hear the wet squelching sound of its many appendages on the snow. It moved slowly into the small clearing around my hiding spot. I was pressed so tightly against the frozen roots that the wood dug painfully into my spine, but I didn't dare flinch. I had already positioned the Remington. My shooting hand gripped the trigger, the barrel angled slightly up and out toward the opening of the root cave, resting against the snow-covered ground. The creature's movement was erratic, darting toward the tree line one moment and then pulling back. Why hasn't it found me? And then I realized it wasn't looking for me. Its massive, misshapen head was constantly sniffing the air, lifting and twisting with jerky movements. The air was thick with a howling blizzard and the scent of damp pine and frozen earth. The storm was masking my scent. The wind and the heavy blowing snow were scattering and nullifying my presence, covering the fresh trace of gunpowder and adrenaline. I was lucky. The storm had become my unintentional ally. After a few minutes, the sniffing paid off. The waddling ceased, and its massive, slimy, hairy form turned directly toward my root cave. It approached the gap between the thick roots, filling the dark space with its bulk. It was so close that I could feel the minute vibrations of its weight disturbing the ground. And then its head lowered. The snow cleared just long enough for me to see the details that I hadn't been able to discern in the blizzard. Its head was roughly the size of a buck or a moose skull, but hideously wrong. The bone structure was too broad, too blunt. It had no discernible eyes, just wide swaths of slick, wet flesh the color of old blood. It wasn't just fur that covered it. Its thick, dark hair was matted with the slime, forming a repulsive, heavy mane. Interspersed within this mane were a horrifying number of short, glistening, leech-like appendages that writhed slightly in the cold air, tasting and searching. And then it was inches from my face. I could smell the metallic stench of the black slime mixed with the sour, coppery odor of raw meat. I was looking into the mouth of the nightmare that had walked out of a man. One of the slick, worm-like appendages darted out, brushing against the tip of my nose. In that instant, it knew. The thing recoiled slightly, its large, blunt head drawing back, the wet flesh of its face tightening into an expression of immediate, primal recognition. The meal was found, the obstacle identified. It was about to strike. But I didn't let it. I drove the barrel of the Remington up and sideways, the muzzle nearly touching the side of its monstrous head. The blast was muffled and wet, an awful contained thunder. The buckshot tore into the creature's skull from below when the thing erupted. A horrifying geyser of black slime, wet fur, and bone fragments sprayed into the roots above me. The creature shuddered once, a massive, muscular tremor before its great weight collapsed. It didn't fall on me, thankfully, but it landed directly outside my hiding spot, its massive body completely blocking the entrance. I lowered the shotgun, the noise of the ringing in my ears louder than the wind. I was trapped beneath a mountain of steaming, reeking horror. The ringing in my ears faded slowly, replaced by the sickening sound of hot, wet matter sizzling on frozen snow. I was entombed. The creature's immense, cooling mass was pressed against the root system, sealing the entrance to my makeshift bunker. I could hear the wind now, muffled by the sheer volume of dead, hairy flesh. I lowered the shotgun slowly, my entire body shaking with a delayed, violent reaction. The smell was overwhelming now. A blast of copper, sulfur, and the sour stink of the creature's slime. The muzzle of the Remington was coated in it. I had to get out. If the blizzard kept up, I'd be trapped here beneath a rotting carcass until the spring melt. I shoved the shotgun's barrel against the creature's flank, testing the weight. No movement. It was like pushing a felled, waterlogged oak tree. I shifted my weight, reaching with my free hand, and finally found the edge of the root that had protected me. I pressed my shoulder against the dirt wall and pushed, straining. The corpse moved an inch and then sank back. I had to try a different way. I turned the shotgun around and used the thick, heavy butt of the stock to scrape away the dirt and packed snow behind me, burrowing deeper into the root system. The ground was hard and frozen, but the shotgun butt gave me just enough leverage to widen a small, cramped gap between two lateral roots. Gasping, I barely squeezed through the opening. I emerged on the far side of the massive pine away from the creature's bulk. I stood up slowly, my heartbeat pounding in my temples, and I walked back over to look at the kill. It lay motionless, its multi-limbed body contorted awkwardly on the snow. But something was wrong. Where the head had been, there was only a ruin of black fur and pulped bone. Yet a thin, milky white steam was rising from the wound. And then I noticed the blood or lack of it. It wasn't bleeding out. The dark black-red slime was only slowly oozing, congealing almost immediately in the bitter cold. The buckshot had caused massive trauma, but the creature's internal volume seemed insufficient for its size. It felt like I had shot a sack of thick fluid rather than a complex biological organism. My eyes caught something on the creature's massive flank, where the first blast of buckshot had hit it. The matted fur had been stripped clean, revealing the skin beneath. It was pale, slick, and thin, stretched tight over the enormous frame. The skin was visibly healing and slowly knitting itself back together. The gaping holes from the shot were shrinking, the raw, pink-red tissue pulling toward a center point. It was a terrifying, impossible regeneration. The steam wasn't from cooling blood. It was from a burning internal process. My breath hitched. The entire premise of this battle that a shotgun could stop it was a lie. I had maybe 10 minutes before it was functional again. I had to get back to the cabin, not just for ammunition, but for something heavier, something more final. I turned and ran like a madman, the snow swallowing my footing, the low branches whipping my face. The familiar trek back to the cabin was a blur of white and black, driven by the cold fear that the monster would simply stand up behind me. I burst through the door, slamming it shut and throwing the deadbolt, though I knew a simple piece of metal wouldn't hold that bulk for long. I raced past the bathroom and into the storage closet. I didn't grab the deer rifle. A bullet was a coin toss, but fire was a guarantee. And tucked behind the winter tires were two red 5-gallon jerry cans, one for the snowmobile, one for the backup generator. I grabbed the can of kerosene too. It would burn slower and hotter than gasoline, and I yanked it out. Next, I needed a wick. I dove into the kitchen, grabbed the thickest rag that I could find, a towel that I used for drying dishes, and I stuffed it into my pocket. The light was my last stop. I opened the kitchen drawer and snagged a long, thin butane lighter used for starting the pilot light. I was ready, but not fast enough. The quiet, heavy silence that I had endured for the past few months was broken up by a sound that I had only heard when cutting down trees. A slow, heavy ripping sound coming from the side of the cabin, the side where the bathroom window was. It had found its way back. The hole that it had created to exit the young man's body wasn't large enough for its current monstrous size, and it wasn't trying to climb through the window. It was tearing the wall apart. I could hear the sickening crunch of frozen pine breaking and the sound of thick wood snapping. I had to assume that it was fully healed or close enough to it. The storm, which had given me cover, now threatened to bury me inside my own cabin if I wasn't careful. I had to take the fire to the monster. I yanked the front door open, the kerosene can heavy and cold in my hand, and I plunged back out into the blizzard. The creature wasn't at the door. I rounded the corner of the cabin, the heavy kerosene sloshing, and I saw the damage. A huge section of the wall near the bathroom was ruined. Wood splintered and insulation streaming out like cotton guts. The creature was there, its massive steaming head pulled back from the shredded wall. It saw me instantly. The bluff of the blizzard had been called. I was standing in the open and it was less than 20 feet away. It began its repulsive, slow waddle toward me. Its limbs churned the snow, the black slime glistened. Its regenerating head tilted low. It was honed in on me. I dropped to a knee, pulling the heavy can close. I twisted the plastic cap off and then tore the towel from my pocket, shoving one end into the neck of the can to soak. The stench of the oil and the creature's musk mingled horribly in the cold air. The monster was 10 feet away. I didn't try to aim, I just tipped the heavy can and began to drench the path between us as I walked backwards. I emptied half the 5 gallons in a wide black arc right into the snow and across the creature's forelimbs. The kerosene didn't mix with the snow. It simply stained it, turning the white ground into a shimmering black slick. The creature didn't stop. It waddled right through the flammable pool, its greasy fur absorbing the oil. As the beast closed the distance, close enough now that I could feel the steam emanating off of it, I pulled the soaked towel out and threw the can aside, and I flicked the butane lighter. The thin blue flame fought the wind for a fraction of a second and then it held. With a final, desperate roar to myself, I lit the kerosene-soaked rag like a torch, and I threw it directly at the monster. It hit the creature's torso and the effect was instantaneous and brutal. The oil-soaked fur and the slick, saturated snow trail ignited with a violent whoosh. The flames were furious, a shocking blast of orange and red against the white snow. The creature was engulfed in a terrible screaming pillar of fire. The kerosene and the creature's own slick, greasy essence fed the flames instantly, making them burn with a blinding hot intensity. The monster shrieked, a sound of agony and pure animal terror, and began to thrash violently in the fire. It wasn't waddling anymore, it was rolling in the snow, trying to beat out the inferno. Fortunately for me, the flames stuck to its oiled coat like glue. It was a chaotic, burning silhouette against the backdrop of the swirling blizzard. The thick black smoke was lost immediately in the swirling white. I backed away. The heat of the fire was a shocking contrast to the bitter cold. I watched the creature convulse, unable to stop the burning, unable to heal what was being systematically destroyed. The smell of burning hair, oil, and something metallic sweet was nauseating. Finally, after a minute that felt like an hour, the thrashing had stopped. The creature lay still, a massive charred monument to my desperate resolve. The fire still raged, but the movement was gone. I leaned against the icy wood of the cabin, the shotgun forgotten at my feet. The flames were already starting to melt a ring of snow around the body, but the blizzard continued to rage. The intense heat from the burning carcass was already beginning to recede, fighting a losing battle against the continuous onslaught of the blizzard. I stood for a moment, letting the sheer exhaustion wash over me, before the pragmatism and determination of the mountain man kicked in. The fire was dying, and what was left of this thing couldn't be allowed to heal or even to rot here. I grabbed the heavy kerosene can and emptied the last of its contents onto the smoldering pile, coaxing the flames back into a furious, consuming roar. I moved the equipment inside and then returned to the blazing carcass with my axe. It took a sickening 15 minutes of hacking and separating what little was left of the creature's bulk. I dragged the black, escaping chunks through the snow and tossed them back into the heart of the blaze. The air was thick with the stench of oil and the sweet, terrible smell of burning meat. I was purging the mountain of this evil. When I was done, only a patch of melted snow and a few glowing embers remained. I stood over the pyre, the axe handle cold in my numb hands, watching the last of the embers fade into the furious white. I turned, intending to head back inside, locked the doors, and faced the grim reality of the split body in the bathroom. And that's when I heard it. It wasn't the wind and it wasn't the groan of a tree. It was a faint, wet screaming wail, identical to the sound the creature had made when the buckshot had first hit it. The sound of ripping canvas and tearing metal. It came from the same direction as the first time, from the depths of the tree line, from where the young man had come. I spun around, bringing the axe up like a shield, searching the blinding, swirling storm. My mind immediately went to the rifle, the thing that I had left behind in the house in my haste. I had nothing but a bloody, snow-covered axe and a dead fire. The wail came again, closer this time, high-pitched and choked. I took a step backward, preparing to fight, when a memory finally pierced the fog of panic. The young man's vacant eyes. The young man's vacant story. I was hiking with my girlfriend, Emma. Shit. When the Department of Defense stated that one of the functions of the Space Force was to deter aggression from space, they were not talking about man-made threats from space or simple natural dangers such as asteroids. What they meant were things that were much worse. Out there in the void, there are great threats that are just lurking and waiting to stumble upon humanity. Solar 6 was the first to discover this truth. Launched as part of the then Air Force Space Command's confidential solar reconnaissance program, the purpose of the initiative was to explore the solar system for a future military application. At the time, the Russians were doing something similar, with them having sent at least 2 probes before our first could even get off the ground. Not wanting to lose the ultimate high ground, Space Commander hastily created and launched interplanetary space probes in order to catch up. And despite being developed in a rush, the probes were well equipped with a powerful array of sensors and visual monitoring equipment, with a lot of the technology used being far greater than what NASA had at the time. Able to relay large amounts of information and high-quality images of the various planets, moons, and asteroids in our system, they were supposed to find potential locations for outposts in deep space. However, what they found instead broke everything that we knew about the universe. The 6th probe launched in the program, Solar 6, was tasked with exploring Jupiter and its moons. It was supposed to be like the other missions, boring and uneventful. But upon entering the sphere of influence of the planet, it began seeing wings. Numbering in the hundreds, gigantic golden wings spanning 1,000 miles long and 100 miles wide started appearing in front of the probe. From what could be observed as the probe moved closer to Jupiter, dozens of these wings littered the planet's orbit. Receiving the video feed more than half an hour after they were taken, Solar 6's mission control quickly studied the footage and they were left baffled. Previous observations of the planet had never noted these objects before. Earth-based, Earth-orbiting telescopes and NASA Pioneer and Voyager missions never noticed them. Even the telescopic images of the planet hours before the probe's approach had no visual of them. Yet there they were right in front of the probe, circling it and almost creating a ring. Unsure of how to proceed after the strange sighting, Mission Control quickly passed on the information up the chain of command. Eventually, the reply back to them was to continue with the probe's orbital insertion, but the objective of the reconnaissance shifted from surveying the moons to surveying the wings. However, as the probe conducted its orbital insertion burn, a new object was sighted. Like the wings, this was not seen from any observation devices on or around Earth. Even with its size, it just couldn't be spotted from our planet. Spanning 2,500 miles in diameter and locked into Jupiter's orbit was a giant sphere. Yet despite its shape, it wasn't a previously undiscovered moon of the planet. Instead, it was another anomaly in this place. And covering the surface of the object were eyes, thousands of them in different sizes, some closed and some open. Along with these eyes were various golden stumps and golden wings, similar to those that were floating around orbit. As the probe got closer and began to orbit around the sphere, two of the stumps on the object were found to be far longer than the rest and seemed to have been composed of a different material that resembled skin. However, imagery and electronic scans were not enough to confirm what the material exactly was at the time. Despite that, from all the initial surveys and studies of the object, the scientists and researchers attached to Mission Control believed that whatever the sphere was, it was a living object. At least it had once been living. Found during the mapping of the surface were two large holes that penetrated its exterior. Closer inspection and radar mapping of these puncture points revealed the hollow interior of the object. The scientists concluded that this was the likely cause of death of this massive creature. That then left the questions of what killed it and where was the perpetrator now. In search for an answer, Solar 6 was maneuvered all over the orbit of Jupiter, trying to locate any other anomaly in the vicinity. Eventually, the probe ended up in the orbit of Callisto, where another anomaly was found. Floating there was a long limb-like object. On one end of this object was a hand with hundreds of fingers that held a sword. The sword measured 1,000 miles long and 50 miles wide. Like the previous anomalies, it was not able to be viewed from Earth. By the time the mission around Jupiter was declared over, the probe had explored the sphere, the hand and sword, as well as 20 of the wings in order to extract as much information as it could from them. And to the dismay of Mission Control though, all the surveying did little to reveal where these anomalies came from, why it was here and how it had met its fate. However, it was at least concluded that all the anomalies found stemmed from one original anomaly, which centered around the large spherical object. Due to this, it as well as its spread of remains, was designated as Cosmic Anomaly Number 1 and marked for future explorations by future probes dedicated to its study. On the other hand, the anomaly responsible for killing Cosmic Anomaly Number 1 was designated as Cosmic Anomaly Number 2, although concrete proof of existence has yet to be found. Furthermore, the presence of such an anomaly, as well as the unknown location and state of the mysterious Cosmic Anomaly Number 2, prompted Air Force Space Command to take more actions at better monitoring and securing deep space. With the government's backing, funds were secretly provided to Air Force Space Command, To the dismay of supporters of the Strategic Defense Initiative, the government believed that threats from deep space were far more concerning than ones from Earth. In order to limit the number of personnel aware of cosmic anomalies so that secrecy could be easier maintained, the Anti-Cosmic Threat Division, or ACT Division for short, was formed by Space Command. That way, all such cosmic issues could be funneled into the division and ensure that no information about them could leak out to the public and cause mass panic. With backing and funding from the government, the ACT Division proceeded to create and launch a series of missions to further increase their monitoring abilities in deep space, fearing that Cosmic Anomaly Number 2 may emerge again and threaten human spacecraft or Earth itself. Unmanned monitoring stations were established at our natural satellite and the natural satellites of Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Additionally, missions were also launched to Jupiter with the goal of further exploring and studying the remnants of Cosmic Anomaly Number 1, with this being humanity's first encounter with an extraterrestrial life form. The scientists attached to the ACT Division were desperate to learn more about it. However, the constant travel of spacecraft from Earth and these solar system's planets resulted in encounters with new cosmic anomalies. Jupiter Picket 10 was to be the 10th monitoring post for the Jupiter observation line. It was supposed to be a fairly normal and uneventful mission, but on the 16th month of its journey, while it was still on approach to Jupiter, it encountered a strange object that suddenly manifested before it. Analysis of footage and radar readings before the encounter showed no sign of anything in the vicinity of the spacecraft at the time. Yet in the flash of a moment, an object that resembled a naval vessel appeared before it. Further examination of the object revealed to Mission Control that it looked similar to a destroyer escort from the Second World War. That alone was a strange sight. However, a careful observation of the object revealed that it wasn't just a mere destroyer somehow lost in space. On the ship's hull, dotted all over it, were various human body parts. From heads, arms, legs, and whole torsos, these parts protruded from the hull and moved frantically and erratically. These parts weren't just sticking out from the ship though. Instead, they seemed to be a part of the ship, somehow merged with the steel that it was made from. Focusing Jupiter Picket 10's camera on the various protruding heads on the hull, a majority of them could be seen with their mouths wide open. Whatever sound they could be making, however, could not be heard through the vacuum of space. From the pained expression on their faces, though, it was believed by many in Mission Control that they were screaming. One head presented a different expression to the rest, though. Located near the bridge of the destroyer escort, the head's eyes stared directly at the probe's camera, as if it knew where it was located. After gazing at the camera with a pained and sad expression, it then opened and closed its mouth slowly, as if it was trying to communicate something. Based on the interpretation of its lip movement, experts concluded that it was trying to say, "Help us." And then, just as suddenly as the object had appeared, it suddenly disappeared, leaving no trace aside from the imagery and data that our probe had recorded. One important piece of information gathered from the encounter was the name and hull number of the destroyer escort. However, when the Air Force inquired the Navy about information on the ship that bore that name and number, all the Navy stated that it had indeed been a ship commissioned with them during the Second World War. All further information about its service, though, were marked as confidential and could not be shared. The ACT Division would eventually label this object as Cosmic Anomaly Number 3, and it would periodically appear and be detected for brief moments of time over the years. As more probes and unmanned installations were launched and positioned across the solar system, the ACT Division slowly but surely got a better look of the deep space that surrounded us. This also meant the revelation of more anomalies. A few years after first encounter with cosmic anomaly number 3, the Activision started losing contact with the picket stationed on Saturn and its moons. One by one, the probes and installations there suddenly stopped transmitting. Reviewing the footage from the probes before they stopped transmitting, the Activision did their best to try to figure out what exactly had happened. It turned out to be a difficult task though, as the available footage didn't show what could have been the cause. And due to this, it was believed that the loss of transmission could have been caused by a sudden interference in the area that prevented the probes and installation from transmitting its signals back to Earth. However, a frame from the footage caught by Saturn Station 16 told a different tale. Emplaced at the moon of Phoebe, it managed to catch sight of something that looked like a scaly tentacle heading towards it. It only appeared briefly, but it caught in it a single frame before transmission was lost. That was the evidence that proved what had happened wasn't a simple signal anomaly. At first, it was believed that this was the result of cosmic anomaly number 2, as it had been the only anomaly that had been deemed active and hostile at the time. Although this caused some fear among the members of the Activision, they were not caught unprepared. They had been preparing for years for such a scenario and soon quickly got into action activating contingency plans. The main contingency plan applied for this threat was Operation Hammer, which relied on armed autonomous probes to deal with the threat. Armed with an array of nuclear-tipped missiles, the probes, dubbed Vanguard Deep Space Strike Vehicles, were to swarm the anomaly and bombard its payload. There was no guarantee that dozens upon dozens of nuclear weapons would be enough to destroy a cosmic anomaly, but at the time it was the best weapon that the Activision had. In order for the Vanguard probes to strike their target though, they must first find it, and due to this, all the probes and installations throughout the solar system were thoroughly monitored to see if they could catch a glimpse of cosmic anomaly number 2. But aside from the loss of the ones at the Saturn observation line, no other monitoring system was lost or had caught sight of the anomaly. It seemed that the threat was limited to the Saturn area. To establish better surveillance of the threat, a series of reconnaissance probes were launched to replace the monitoring posts that were lost at Saturn, so that these probes would reach Saturn quickly and prevent the anomaly from disappearing while we were blind. They were equipped with the continuous acceleration drive. This new propulsion system enabled spacecraft to increase its speed substantially and cut down travel time through the solar system. Yet despite this, the first of the reconnaissance probes, Eagle Eye 1, did not arrive at Saturn's sphere of influence until 13 months after its launch. Due to this, it was feared by many in the Activision that the anomaly had slipped past them during the wide interval. As it would turn out, that wasn't the case. The moment the probe got close to Saturn, a set of scaly tentacles suddenly reached out towards it. The speed of the tentacles was so fast that they were barely caught by the probe's cameras. One moment it was flying through space, and the next it was held in place and unable to maneuver away. It was just like what had happened to Saturn Station 16. This time it was different though. Instead of immediately destroying the probe, the tentacle wrapped itself around it first and held it in place. Then, to the surprise of everybody in mission control, a smaller tentacle suddenly emerged and began tapping on one of the probe's cameras. The tapping continued for a few minutes, before the tentacle began rubbing itself on the camera's lens. As it did this, a dark black red liquid was left imprinted on the lens. Eventually, it managed to write out, "Leave me alone." After that, a signal from Eagle Eye 1 was lost. Due to the passivity of the anomaly and the fact that it seemed to be fixed in its orbit, the Activision concluded that the living planet of Saturn was not cosmic anomaly number 2, but a different anomaly of its own. With its tentacles' impressive yet still limited reach, it declared impossible for it to have attacked cosmic anomaly number 1 at Jupiter. Saturn was thus labeled as Cosmic Anomaly Number 4. Realizing that no amount of nuclear warheads would be enough to destroy a planet, Operation Hammer was canceled before the Vanguard probes could connect their trans-Saturn injection. Meanwhile, the reconnaissance probes already sent out were maneuvered to ensure that they positioned themselves in a high orbit above Saturn, thus ensured that they were just out of reach of the planet's deadly tentacles. Once in a while, the high-orbiting probes would observe the planet, attempt to grab for them, but to no avail. The first face-to-face encounter between man and the anomaly occurred during REAP missions. The missions were a part of a wider operation called Lazarus, which had the main goal of collecting the remains of Cosmic Anomaly Number 1 in order to further study them and see what could be useful for humanity. The mission also happens to be my first assignment with the ACT Division after graduating from the Air Force's astronaut training program. Assigned to mission control, I was one of the astronauts that acted as Capcom for the 5-man crew aboard the manned deep space transporter heading to Jupiter. Thanks to the continuous acceleration drive, travel time for the crew to their destination only took 8 months. However, barely even 2 months into their journey, the mission encountered something strange. It began with an alert. Deep space monitoring satellites in Earth orbit and the radar aboard the spacecraft detected a dense group of unidentified objects ahead of the vehicle. Observing these objects and calculating their trajectory, it was found that they were on a perpendicular path towards the spacecraft. Knowing the dangers of flying into a field of deep space objects, the mission's FIDO suggested a quick maneuver to ensure that the spacecraft avoided intersecting with the objects. However, before I could call them up to relay this to the crew, the commander of the spacecraft sent out a transmission first.
Midway, this is Reaper 1. Came the call on my headset and the speakers around the mission control center. Are you seeing what we're seeing? I think we see someone floating in there.
Reaper 1, this is Midway, I transmitted. What do you mean by someone? Do you mean an anomaly or do you mean humans? The distance between us and the spacecraft meant that there would be a delay in the reply. As we waited though, the mission's Cronus displayed the video feed that was being received directly from Reaper 1. In it we could see footage from one of the high-powered exterior cameras being controlled by the crew, as they pointed and focused in on the unknown object cluster. Zooming in on the cluster, images of various broken and torn spacecraft modules could be seen floating in space. It then became evident that the objects being detected were from a destroyed spacecraft. A further scan of some of these modules revealed the Russian flag, giving us an identity as to where they were from. Air Force Space Command had known that Russian spacecraft were also operating in deep space, but the fact that one of them was destroyed was news to me. As the camera shifted away from the modules, it soon focused in on a different subject. Caught in the middle of the cluster was a figure of a man, naked, bloated, and completely exposed to the vacuum of space. The man floated freely among the debris. He wasn't alone though. 3 more men were seen floating freely just like him, completely unprotected and bloated. And due to their situation, it wasn't hard to understand why many in mission control quickly concluded that they were dead and had most likely been sucked out when their spacecraft was suddenly destroyed. However, continued observation pointed out that there was something wrong about them. When comparing their size with the size of the debris around them, it was soon realized that they were far larger than it. Estimates revealed that the 4 floating men were at least 50 meters in height. Yet that wasn't the only strange thing about it.
Midway, this is Reaper 1.
Came the sudden transmission from the crew as we at mission control scratched our heads and wondered what had happened to those cosmonauts.
We think they're still alive.
Sure enough, as we further studied the footage, we could see subtle movements from each of the men, as their arms and legs fidgeted and swung. Somehow, despite being completely exposed to the harshness of space, they were still alive. They weren't just alive though, they were also fully conscious and in complete pain. Reaper 1 eventually maneuvered just enough to avoid the cluster, yet still close enough to get a good look at it from its cameras. The crew and us in mission control got a better look of the cosmonauts. The image would forever be ingrained in my mind. Eyes bloated, expression contorted in pain. They were clearly suffering. Somehow, something was preventing death to end their torture. As the cluster passed by and continued on its journey, I shuddered at the thought that they would be forever stuck in a solar orbit, unable to end their pain, as they drifted in space for eternity. The ACT division would label those 4 unfortunate cosmonauts, including whatever caused them to expand that large and become seemingly immortal, as Cosmic Anomaly number 5. Following a year-long assignment as a Capcom for a few more REAP missions, I eventually began training for a long-term space operations in order to join in the next phase of Operation Lazarus. When I was finally sent up a year and a half after the training, I found myself on a journey to Jupiter and my new place of deployment, Archangel Station. And built within the remains of Cosmic Anomaly number 1, Archangel Station was the farthest manned outpost the ACT division had in deep space. Created in order to easier study the remnants of the anomaly, as well as ensure that the nation had a strong presence at Jupiter. The station was thus a crucial part of Space Command. When I first arrived at the station, the majority of its infrastructure had already been completed. Beneath the surface of the once living entity, a series of layered structures were constructed, which housed the living quarters, the command center, the science bay, nuclear reactors, and various other facilities necessary for the station's mission and day-to-day needs. There was, however, a lot of activity and new construction when I had arrived at the station. As we approached the monstrous sphere orbiting Jupiter, I saw some astronauts conducting EVAs on one side of the facility, where they conducted work to attach and secure dozens of continuous acceleration drives onto the surface. Meanwhile, on a different portion of the sphere, work was being done for an extremely large docking area, with various electrical wiring, hydraulics, and strange red-colored calves being placed there by a team of astronauts. What exactly they were doing there, I wasn't sure at the time, but I made no effort trying to figure it out. After all, my mission here involves something else, and I didn't want to waste time wondering about things that I knew I wouldn't get the answers to unless the ACT division deemed it necessary for me to know. After a month of getting acquainted with life in the station and assisting in various auxiliary duties, I and 44 other astronauts were transported out of the station and sent to Callisto, in orbit around the moon, to a relatively small outpost in comparison to Archangel Station. Labeled as Outpost number 12, the modular station could house up to 100 astronauts and orbited around the moon. Meanwhile, directly below it and also orbiting Jupiter's natural satellite was the titanic, anomalous sword and severed arm of Cosmic Anomaly number 1. Our mission at Outpost number 12 was simple: to recover the sword and bring it to Archangel Station for studying and testing. However, throughout the entire process, our stay in the station was anything but peaceful. It all began with the voices. No matter what time it was, somehow the sound of hoarse, tired, and sorrowful voices echoed from outside the walls of the station. We didn't know how it was possible, and video observation of the hall revealed nothing there, yet we could hear it. And during my first sleep cycle at Outpost 12, the voices kept on speaking words that I couldn't understand. It kept me up all through the hours that I was supposed to be sleeping, as I felt uneasy the entire time and felt as if someone was watching me because of them. Of course, senior officers at Archangel Station were aware of this situation after we had informed them of what we were hearing. The suggestion of the chief medical officers over there was for us to use sleeping pills to get through our sleeping cycles, but somehow they did little to help us, as the voices still kept us awake. By my second sleep cycle, the voices started to become clearer, as I was able to understand some of the words that they were saying.
Help. Michael. Flames.
All the words they said seemed random, but they kept me up again nonetheless. Attempts to drown out the noise with a headset and music were met with utter failure too, as I could somehow still hear them despite those tools. And by the third night, however, I somehow got acclimated to the noise and eventually got some much needed rest. When I woke up, a lot of the other astronauts, aside from an unlucky few, had also gotten used to the voices. However, on day 7 of our stay there, things started to become stranger. I had just finished a long work cycle, having conducted hours of EVA to attach maneuvering thruster pods onto the anomalous swords. As I closed my eyes to start my sleep cycle, I heard the usual call of the voices start, but there was something different. Suddenly opening my eyes, I stared at the walls of my cabin and I listened once again.
Son, is that you?
The voice said, but this wasn't the voice of a stranger. It was the voice of my long-deceased father.
Son, please talk to me.
The voice spoke again, continuing to bear my father's voice. Hearing it speak with my father's voice made me sure that I wasn't just imagining it. It was definitely his voice that I was hearing, and it sent a shiver of fear down my spine. How was it doing that? How did it know my father's voice? He had been dead for years. Sighing, I tried my best to ignore it. I had learned how to sleep with the voices for a few days by that point, so I was sure that I could do it again. And yet I couldn't. Hearing them steal my father's voice and use it to call to me specifically brought a new form of fear and uneasiness. And by the time that my sleep cycle had ended, it was clear that I wasn't the only one suffering from the new attacks that these bodiless anomalies were doing. My batch that was scheduled to sleep that night were kept awake by hearing voices of loved ones and friends calling out to them. Other astronauts who went through followed us suffered the same fate. This was bad news for us who had just gotten used to sleeping with the noise, but even worse for those who still hadn't rested at all. Eventually, Major Stewart, the commander of the outpost, had to place these people on light duty, as they were clearly not fit to do any other work. For days, the voices continued to call to us, with each person hearing different voices of people that they knew each time they tried to go to sleep. For me, I heard the voices of my father, mother, ex-girlfriends, and even old teachers call out to me. It was terrible, and I often ended up shouting back at the voices, telling them to stop. And during some sleep cycles, I was able to block out the noise and get some resemblance of sleep. But eventually, I would be rudely awakened, as the voices called out my name just to disturb me. After a few days of such a constant harassment, it began to take a toll on me and everybody on board. Work efficiency drastically dropped, yet we powered on, knowing that the sooner we accomplished our task, the sooner we would leave. And then came the incident. It happened during the end of my work shift, and due to the fatigue I gained from the recent change in the voices, I was relegated to light duties as a communications officer in the command module of the outpost. And joining me there was Lieutenant Phillips, a younger astronaut who I got to know pretty well on the way to the Jupiter observation line. Like me, he was fatigued by the recent change in the voices and was given light duties as the outpost systems officer. Unlike me though, he looked like a walking zombie, with large, dark bags under his bloodshot eyes. He was clearly in far worse shape than I was. While I only lost sleep when the voices started bearing the names of people that we knew, Phillips had barely slept at all since we were sent to the outpost. In the almost 2 weeks that we've been there, he's only had 3 sleep cycles of rest and none of them complete and continuous. And that was why he was assigned to light duties, such as keeping an eye on the outpost systems, because it would cause the least trouble if he ever slipped up from fatigue. At least, that was what we thought at the time. As I was floating by the communication system, headset on and listening to the chatter by those out on EVA, I suddenly heard someone speak inside the module. At first, I thought it was Phillips greeting Major Stewart, who was supposed to be checking up on us around that time. To my surprise, though, Major Stewart wasn't there. As I turned around to check, all I saw was Phillips talking to himself. Curious, I slowly took off my headset and managed to catch a portion of what he was saying. "Yes, Major, I'll do it immediately," was what Phillips said, before floating towards the control panel that controlled the outposts, hatches, and airlocks. And before I could even ask him what he was doing, he suddenly started opening a few of switch guards before quickly flipping the switches. Suddenly, an alarm in the command module started blaring and screeching, as a screen nearby alerted that the air pressure in the crew quarters module was plummeting. Turning my head to another screen, I watched in horror as the surveillance camera pointed at Airlock D displayed fellow astronauts being sucked out of their cabins and thrown into the vacuum of space. "What did you do?" I asked, as I pushed my way and quickly floated towards the control panel that Phillips was at, and began switching them back to close the hatches that he had opened. "I was just following the Major's orders," Phillips simply replied to me. I stared back at him with a confused expression. "The Major's orders?" I said in disbelief, as I gestured it to the module that was empty aside from the presence of us two. "Are you out of your mind? He's not here." "No," he simply said in reply as he shook his head. "His orders were loud and clear. Open the airlocks, that's what he told me directly." "Phillips, nobody gave you those orders," I yelled back. And then a voice spoke to me. It was Major Stewart's voice. "That's right. No one gave him those orders. He simply acted on his own." Relieved to finally have some backup, I turned around hoping to see Major Stewart there. But he wasn't. Instead, it was just the empty module. And that was strange. I swear that I heard the Major for a second. Turning back to face Phillips, I looked at him to see an empty expression on his face. It didn't yet seem that he had realized what he had done. "Oh, the fatigue has gotten to him." The Major's voice spoke again. I turned around once more, but like before, he wasn't there. This was starting to scare me as I looked around the module, hoping to see any sign of the Major. Perhaps it came from the radio, I eventually thought. Maybe I was hearing his voice echoing up from my headset. With the headset still connected to the radio on the other side of the module, it seemed strange that I managed to hear the Major's voice so clearly, but it was the only logical explanation.
"You must kill him to protect the outposts."
A chill ran down my spine as I heard that. I suddenly felt scared. But it wasn't because of what the Major's voice said. No, it wasn't because of that. It was because I was certain that I heard the voice from inside my head. How was that possible?
"Kill him."
The voice repeated, more aggressive this time.
"Do it. Kill him."
The voice ordered, as I placed my hands on my ears. It was to no avail though, as I could still hear the voice.
"Kill him."
It repeated, but this time it sounded different.
"Kill him and save the outposts."
At that point I realized that it now sounded like my voice. It was starting to sound as if it was my own thoughts telling me what to do.
"Kill him, kill him, kill him."
As the voice inside my head raised, a crescendo in my head, another voice suddenly echoed out. What the hell happened here? It was the Major's voice again, but this time it sounded different. Turning around, I was thankful to see Major Stewart and 2 other officers floating by the entrance to the module, looking at me before turning their attention to Phillips, and then they floated towards us to understand what exactly had unfolded. In the end, Phillips was confined into the medical bay before being transported out of Outpost 12 and sent back to the station for further examination and treatment. From what I heard, the moment that he left the outpost, he seemed to have returned to his normal self, although the news that his actions had resulted in the death of 20 fellow astronauts seemed to have scared him. Following the incident, those of us who stayed for a few more days to finish attaching a few more thruster pods on the Titan sword before we too were ordered out of Outpost number 12. The moment that we got out of there was one of the happiest moments in my life, and I suddenly felt free from the constant voices. My first sleep cycle at Archangel Station after our return was the best sleep that I had my entire life, and due to the harassing voices, which was eventually labeled as Cosmic Anomaly number 6, deployment to Outpost number 12 was limited to a week. This resulted in the constant shifting of personnel and slow progress on the retrieval of the Titan sword, but I didn't care. I was glad that I was out of the outpost and lucky that I didn't get assigned there again. The rest of my stay in Archangel Station revolved around helping with the rather large docking port. Every work cycle that I spent there, I wondered why such a large docking port was needed. Eventually, though, I got my answer. A large arm was one day sent to the station, and it looked both grotesque and intriguing. Looking nearly too close to a human arm, it was extremely bloated and red. Covering it were various mechanical and electronic parts that were stabbed into the skin of the arm. Us junior officers were not exactly sure where the arm came from, but some of us had our theories. It was a common topic at the mess hall, and I remember the favorite theory involved experimentations with Cosmic Anomaly number 5. By the time that I left Archangel Station, the hand had been fully attached to the docking port built for it. Also completed was the recovery of the sword in orbit of Callisto. As the spacecraft I was on began its journey back to Earth, I couldn't help but stare at the small viewing port and look at the Titanic sword floating next to the station and close to the large swollen hand now on it. Now, I can't help but think about that again. I am set to return back to the station soon, and a lot has changed since I was last there. The station has had a lot of additions placed on and in it, and in its mission has changed from a simple research and symbolic station to one that was crucial to the defense of the solar system. Meanwhile, I had risen through the ranks to become a lieutenant colonel in the Act Division, which was now part of the Space Force. With the creation of this new branch, more funding and resources were provided to us to protect Earth and maintain the secret of cosmic threats away from the public. Yet now I've decided to post this before I leave and break the very secret that we have worked hard to protect. It is important that I do this now before I leave, because I fear that I won't have another opportunity to do so, and I doubt that the government will dare say a thing if we fail in our mission. We have found Cosmic Anomaly number 2, and it has its eyes on Earth. Our only hope of stopping it is using the carcass of an anomaly it had defeated before.